Settle in, get comfortable, pull the blanket up a little higher if you need to. Tonight we're going somewhere familiar. A quiet little town, yellow sky, cracked cooling towers on the horizon, the sound of a television playing in a living room on Evergreen Terrace, where a family that has never once aged sits on a couch they've sat on for 36 years, watching a world that keeps changing around them while they stay exactly the same. We're going to Springfield, and we're going to stay there for a while. This is a slow walk through some of the strangest, most elaborate, most quietly unsettling theories that fans have built around The Simpsons over the last 3 decades. Some of them have been addressed by the show's writers, some of them haven't. Some of them connect in ways that feel almost too deliberate to be accidental. And all of them, every single one, will change the way you look at the show the next time you put it on. So just breathe. Close your eyes if you want to. Let the story wash over you. We're heading into Springfield, and we're going deeper than we've ever gone before. Section 1. The Nuclear Power Plant and the Mutation Theory. Picture Springfield from above. You're looking down at a mid-sized American town. There are neighborhoods and schools and a bar and a church and a hospital and a retirement home. There's a harbor. There's a gorge. There's a patch of forest at the edge of town where the streetlights don't quite reach. It looks, from up here, like any other American community that might have existed at any point between the 1970s and today. But then your eye catches it. On the north side of town, sitting along the river, there are 2 cooling towers. They're wide at the bottom, narrow in the middle, wide again at the top. The shape that everyone who has ever driven past a nuclear facility recognizes immediately, even if they've never consciously thought about what it means. And the towers are cracked. Not a little cracked. Not a hairline fracture you'd need a magnifying glass to spot. They're cracked in the way old buildings get cracked when nobody has maintained them in decades. The kind of cracks that let things through. That's the Springfield nuclear power plant. It has been operating in some form for as long as the town has existed. It is the primary source of electrical power for every home and business in Springfield. It employs a substantial portion of the town's working population. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the oldest, wealthiest, most powerful man in Springfield, and possibly in the entire state. And if you follow the water downstream from those cracked towers, you'll find the river that feeds into the reservoir, that feeds into the tap water that every single person in Springfield drinks every single day. Now, before we go any further, just sit with that for a moment. Let that image settle. Because what we're about to go through is not a theory built on speculation or wishful thinking. The evidence for what's been happening in Springfield is embedded in the show itself. Episode after episode, season after season, going all the way back to the very beginning. The show has been telling you this story the whole time. Most people just weren't listening. Let's start with what we know for certain, because the certainties alone are remarkable. The Springfield nuclear power plant received a surprise safety inspection at some point in the show's early seasons. The result of that inspection was the discovery of 342 separate safety violations. Not 3, not a dozen. 342. The estimated cost to bring the facility into compliance with basic safety standards was $56 million. Charles Montgomery Burns, a man whose personal wealth is measured in the billions, refused to spend it. The violations were left unaddressed, the inspectors apparently left, and the plant continued operating. Now, what were those violations? The show gives us glimpses. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive waste being deposited onto playgrounds where children play. A piece of plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's actual desk. Cooling towers patched with chewing gum, the kind of repair you'd make to a leaking pipe if you were 8 years old and had nothing else available. Not the kind of repair anyone should make to the outer casing of a nuclear reactor. Rats in the facility that glow with their own bioluminescence. And, perhaps most disturbingly, human skeletons in the basement. The show mentions this and moves on. There are bones in the basement of a working nuclear power plant, and nobody asks a single follow-up question about them. Not the inspector, not the police, not a curious journalist, nobody. The person whose entire professional responsibility is to prevent any of this from happening is Homer Simpson. Homer's job title is Safety Inspector. He has held this position for the entirety of the show's run. He is, by almost any measure you care to apply, catastrophically unsuited for it. The show's own creator has stated on record that Homer's IQ sits at around 55. In a later episode, it's revealed that Homer has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically blocking neural pathways and reducing his cognitive function to a level that most standardized assessments would classify as clinically impaired. Homer sleeps at his workstation with such regularity that it seems to be part of his daily routine. He has, on at least one documented occasion, caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen to it. That is the man standing between Springfield's water supply and radioactive catastrophe. And he has been standing there, failing at that job in increasingly creative ways, for over 3 decades. Now, here's where the theory begins to build into something you can't easily dismiss. The first externally visible sign that something is deeply wrong in Springfield appears in Season 2. A 3-eyed fish is pulled from a river near the power plant. His name, within the show, becomes Blinky. He is a fish with 3 eyes, not 2. 3. A mutation. An adaptation that no wild fish develops through natural evolutionary pressure, because natural evolutionary pressure doesn't produce extrasensory organs in a few decades. Mutations of that kind are produced by environmental contamination, by chemical or radioactive exposure, by something in the water that is rewriting the instructions coded into living cells. Blinky becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as campaign evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns is eventually forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that the contamination is harmless. The town watches. The gubernatorial candidate loses. And then, with breathtaking collective indifference, Springfield moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody examines the fish population. Nobody asks the question that should have been on every single resident's lips from the moment Blinky was pulled out of that river. If the fish downstream from a nuclear plant are developing extra eyes, what is the same water doing to the people drinking it? The show answers this question. It just does it quietly, over the course of 36 seasons, and it trusts you to connect the dots yourself. Look at the population of Springfield. Not just the Simpson family, everyone. Every character who has grown up in this town, who has spent their life breathing its air and drinking its water, shares a set of physical characteristics that do not appear in populations that haven't been exposed to whatever is running through Springfield's ecosystem. The overbites, the bulging eyes, the 4-fingered hands, the yellow skin, that particular shade of yellow specifically that covers every Springfield resident from birth and covers no one else. When characters arrive in Springfield from outside the town, they look different. Their eyes are more normally proportioned. Their features more closely resemble actual human anatomy. The show draws outsiders with slightly different proportions than it draws people who have spent their lives in Springfield. The standard explanation for this is that it's simply the art style. That's just how The Simpsons looks. But when you examine it through the lens of the radiation theory, that difference in appearance becomes something else entirely. It becomes evidence. The people inside the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look normal. And the show has been drawing that distinction from the very beginning. Homer's physical characteristics deserve more attention than they usually get. The man has survived being shot, electrocuted, thrown from cliffs, struck by multiple cars, caught in explosions, and exposed to an enormous variety of physical traumas that would, under any realistic biological calculation, have killed an ordinary human being many times over. His healing rate is extraordinary. His pain tolerance is somewhere between remarkable and inhuman, and his body absorbs punishment in a way that suggests his cellular biology has adapted, through prolonged exposure to something, to operate outside the normal parameters of human tissue. Marge Simpson worked at the nuclear plant herself, at some point. She was exposed to the same facility, the same leaking systems, the same ambient radiation that Homer has soaked in for his entire adult life. And all 3 of their children, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie, were born after both parents had already spent years in Springfield's contaminated environment. All 3 display the same suite of physical characteristics shared by every other Springfield resident. The spiky hair that maintains its shape without product, a quality that should not physically be possible. The eyes, the skin, the 4 fingers. Santa's little helper, the family dog, has bulging eyes and proportions that don't quite match real canine anatomy. Even the animal the family chose as a pet carries the marks of Springfield's environment. And then there is the most important piece of evidence: Mr. Burns himself. In a Season 8 episode, Homer encounters what he believes is an alien creature in the woods near Springfield. The town panics. FBI investigators are brought in. The episode builds carefully toward a dramatic reveal, and when the truth is finally disclosed, the alien isn't an alien at all. It's Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical regimen so extreme, so saturated with chemical and radiation therapy, that after each session his body emits a visible green glow. He wanders out of the treatment facility in a dazed, euphoric state, moving through the woods like something from another world. He literally glows in the dark. That's not a figure of speech. The man is so thoroughly saturated with radiation that his body produces visible light. And the people of Springfield, confronted with a glowing humanoid figure stumbling through their local forest, collectively decided their first hypothesis should be extraterrestrial life. Not the nuclear power plant that sits on the edge of their town. Not the radiation. An alien. The denial runs that deep. The conditioning runs that deep. The incapacity for critical reasoning about their own environment runs that deep. Burns knows what he's done. He has always known. The show makes this explicit across multiple episodes. He funds private medical research. He has personal physicians. He maintains a pharmaceutical operation capable of producing experimental treatments that don't exist anywhere in conventional medicine. He understands radiation at a level that goes far beyond what any power plant owner would need to understand, because he is personally dependent on managing radiation's effects within his own body. He lives with it. He manages it. It keeps him alive. And if Burns understands what radiation does to biological systems at that level of intimacy, he has always understood what his leaking plant is doing to the people who live downstream from it. He has always known. He just calculated that the benefits outweighed whatever obligations he might theoretically have to the people of Springfield. There's a detail about Homer's employment that becomes very dark once you look at it this way. When a group of German investors briefly purchased the nuclear plant, the first thing they did, before anything else, was fire Homer Simpson. Not because they didn't like him personally, because a competent safety inspector would shut that facility down within weeks. A competent safety inspector would look at 342 violations and have the entire plant condemned before Burns could get his lawyers on the phone. Homer's job, his continued presence in the safety inspector chair, is not a mistake or a quirk of Burns's management style. It is a deliberate strategic decision. Homer ensures the violations continue. Homer ensures the radiation keeps leaking. Homer ensures that the water stays poisoned and the ecosystem stays compromised, and the population of Springfield stays exactly the way Burns needs them to be. Too cognitively impaired to figure out what's happening. Too physically adapted to the contamination to notice the symptoms. Too reliant on the economy Burns controls to ever seriously challenge the man who controls it. The show confirmed its own thesis in the most explicit way possible when it made the leap to a feature film. In the Simpsons movie, Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a breaking point so severe that the Environmental Protection Agency, an actual federal agency operating within the show's fictional universe, concludes that the town poses too great a risk to the surrounding region. Their solution is physical containment. A massive glass dome is lowered over the entire town, sealing every single resident inside with the pollution they have been generating and absorbing for decades. The United States government, within the logic of the show, looked at Springfield and decided that the only appropriate response was to quarantine it. That is not a comedic exaggeration. That is the show's writers spelling out, in the clearest possible terms, what they have been implying since Season 2. Springfield is a contamination zone. Its residents are not eccentric characters in a quirky animated sitcom. They are symptomatic. They are what you get when you expose a human population to decades of unregulated nuclear runoff and then give the most cognitively impaired person in the facility the title of safety inspector. And here's the part that lingers longest after you've thought about all of this. In Season 12, Homer has the crayon removed from his brain. His IQ skyrockets. He becomes articulate and thoughtful, and capable of engaging with the world around him at a level he has never managed before. He sees Springfield clearly for the first time. He understands his job. He understands his life. He understands the architecture of the system he's been living inside. And it makes him miserable, profoundly, completely miserable, because the clearer he sees, the more there is to grieve. So he has the crayon put back in. He chooses to return to the fog. He makes the deliberate decision to stop seeing because seeing is unbearable. But here's the question the show never asks directly. How did the crayon get there in the first place? Homer was a child when it happened. He went through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life, visiting Springfield's medical professionals, getting checkups and examinations, and not a single doctor ever found a foreign object in his skull? Not one. Either every physician in Springfield is operating at a level of incompetence so profound it defies any reasonable explanation, or someone knew the crayon was there and made a decision not to remove it. If the medical establishment in Springfield is compromised, if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a town he economically controls, then Homer's crayon isn't just a strange childhood accident. It's the show handing you a metaphor and trusting you to understand what it means. There is something wrong with the brains of Springfield's residents. Something that keeps them compliant. Something that keeps them from asking the most basic questions that any rational person, given the available evidence, should be asking every single day they wake up in that town. The radiation theory doesn't explain one mystery. It explains all of them, woven together into a single coherent picture of a community that has been slowly, systematically poisoned by the facility at the center of its economy. And the most frightening part isn't the contamination itself. It's that the contamination has done its most important work not on the bodies of the people living there, but on their ability to notice that anything is wrong. Springfield isn't a quirky cartoon town. It's a company town. And the company has made sure the workers can't think clearly enough to demand better terms. Hey, before we move on, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something kind of wonderful about knowing people are settling in all over the world right now. And if you're enjoying this, subscribing helps more than you'd think. Okay, back to Springfield. Number. Section 2. Homer's coma theory. Now we need to reframe everything you just heard. Because there is a theory, the most popular and most debated fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons, that doesn't dispute the radiation theory so much as it relocates it. It suggests that everything we just discussed, the mutations, the contamination, the yellow skin, and the 4 fingers and the leaking cooling towers may be entirely accurate, but only as facts inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since the spring of 1993. Let's go back to April of that year. Season 4 was wrapping up. The Simpsons had been on the air for about 3 years at that point, and it was already a cultural phenomenon. The show had established itself as something genuinely new in American television. Funny and sharp and emotionally real in a way that animated series weren't supposed to be. The storylines were grounded. Homer's drinking problem, Marge's anxiety, Lisa's loneliness, Bart's struggles at school. Real family problems told through the lens of satire, but rooted in the kind of situations real families recognize. Then came the 18th episode of Season 4. Its title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise, on the surface, was simple enough. Bart plays a series of April Fool's Day pranks on Homer, escalating with each one, until he takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer eventually opens the can, the explosion is violent enough to put him in the hospital. He's lying in a hospital bed, recovering, when he notices a vending machine across the room. He tries to get a candy bar. The machine tips over and crushes him, and Homer Simpson flatlines. He enters a coma, a real coma, one that lasts 7 weeks within the show's narrative. The episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart confesses tearfully at his bedside. Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling his son. The family laughs. The credits roll. Everything goes back to normal. Except for one detail the episode drops in its final moments. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% gone, permanently. Not recoverable, not treatable, just gone. And Homer's response to being told he has sustained permanent brain damage is to start laughing, even though he can't explain why he's laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody flags it as alarming. The episode ends and the show continues for another 32 seasons as if the whole thing was a footnote. Unless it wasn't. Unless Homer never woke up at all. This is the Homer coma theory. And the reason it has endured for as long as it has, the reason it circulates continuously in fan communities and gets revisited by people who have watched the show for decades, is that it is internally coherent in a way that most fan theories simply are not. It doesn't require you to stretch the available evidence. It doesn't ask you to ignore contradictions. If anything, It resolves contradictions that every other theory struggles with. The basic premise is this: Homer did not regain consciousness in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date is a dream being generated by the mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function, while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. Now, let's walk through why this holds together. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a specific kind of show, grounded even within its cartoon logic. The storylines dealt with recognizable domestic problems: financial stress, marital tension, academic failure. The emotional stakes were high, but the events were believable. The show felt like it was set in a version of the real world that had been slightly tilted for comedic purposes, but not broken. The problems Homer and Marge faced were problems real couples face. The fights Bart picked with his teachers were fights real kids pick. The sadness Lisa felt about not fitting in was real sadness. After the coma, something changes, not gradually, not subtly. The shift is seismic, and once you've been told to look for it, it's impossible to miss. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society with elaborate rituals and a hidden lodge beneath Springfield. Homer discovers that his mother has been alive all along and is a fugitive wanted by federal authorities. Homer meets God, twice. On two separate occasions, Homer Simpson has a direct, face-to-face conversation with the divine. The show transforms from a domestic sitcom about recognizable human problems into something else entirely. Something wilder, something stranger, something that operates on the internal logic of a dream rather than the internal logic of the real world. The internet has been arguing about when The Simpsons got bad for 20 years. Various golden age cutoffs get proposed and debated. But the coma theory doesn't frame this as the show getting bad. It frames it as the show accurately depicting what happens to the mind of someone who has been unconscious for years. Dreams escalate. They become more elaborate and more detached from reality the longer they run. They start incorporating fragments of external stimuli. The narrative coherence degrades. The plots become bigger and stranger. The world keeps expanding in ways that real life never would. Homer's brain, lying unconscious in a hospital bed, would receive ambient input from the environment around him. The television in the room, conversations happening at his bedside, the radio, voices and names and cultural references filtering through the fog of unconsciousness and being woven into the dream. That's why later seasons are flooded with celebrity guest appearances in ways that earlier seasons weren't. Homer's dreaming brain is processing sounds from the world outside, translating names and voices into characters who walk into Springfield and interact with his family. Every celebrity who shows up on Evergreen Terrace is, in this reading, a voice Homer heard through his coma, transformed into a dream figure by a mind that is desperately trying to keep the simulation running. But here's the detail that makes this theory genuinely haunting, the one that adds a layer of almost unbearable poignancy to the whole thing. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer has a conversation with God. The episode is called Homer the Heretic, and it's one of the show's most celebrated episodes. Homer, after skipping church one Sunday and discovering that staying home feels wonderful, develops a theological crisis that eventually leads to a direct conversation with a divine figure. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells him that Homer will eventually learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God says, "Your time is coming." 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. His time came. God told him, 6 months in advance, that the clock on his conscious life was running out. And then, right on schedule, it did. The show presents this as a throwaway theological joke in one episode and a separate storyline entirely in another. But if you sit with both episodes together, if you let the connection breathe, what you get is something that reads less like coincidence and more like a prophecy. God was telling Homer that his waking life was nearly over. Everything that followed would be the dream of a dying man holding onto his family the only way he still could. The aging problem is the piece of evidence that the coma theory handles most elegantly. No other theory resolves it as cleanly. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge haven't gained a wrinkle or a gray hair between them. The show uses a floating timeline. A production convention where the characters present is always the audience's present, but the characters themselves remain frozen. Every theory about the show attempts to explain this. The radiation theory proposes that mutations at the cellular level have disrupted normal biological aging. The cartoon logic explanation says it's just how animated shows work and you shouldn't think about it too hard. The coma theory has the simplest answer, and also the saddest one. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went under in April 1993 and has not surfaced since. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine his children growing older because it wasn't there to see it happen. It has no reference material for what Bart looks like at 14, or 20, or 35. It has no template for what Marge looks like with gray hair, or what Lisa looks like with her adult features settled into their permanent configuration. The last images Homer's brain has of his family are the images it captured on the day the vending machine fell. And so, that's what they look like. That's what they'll always look like, for as long as the dream continues. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it was on the day he lost consciousness. Because that's what the unconscious mind does when it's cut off from new input. It loops, it recombines. It runs the same material through different scenarios, generating variations on a theme, because the theme is all it has. And the theme, for Homer, is simple. His family. His house on Evergreen Terrace. The life he'd built, and the people he loved. The show itself has engaged with this theory more directly than any other piece of fan speculation about The Simpsons. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was initially described as a leaked deleted scene, in which Homer wakes from a long coma and the entire run of the show is revealed to have been a dream. The writers created this scene deliberately. They animated it, they voiced it, they deployed it as a direct reference to the fan theory that had been circulating for decades. And then they said it was a hoax. A fake scene planted by fictional hackers. The whole thing was an elaborate joke. But the fact that they made it at all is telling. The writers know about this theory. They have known about it for a long time. They have thought about it seriously enough to commit it to animation. And when they pushed back against it, when they insisted that Homer isn't in a coma and the show isn't a dream, they did so by showing you exactly what the coma theory claims is true, and then saying it was fake. They showed you the truth and called it a hoax. And the audience laughed, exactly as Homer laughed when he was told he'd lost 5% of his brain. Al Jean, the show's longtime executive producer, addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it wasn't true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. But he didn't explain the tonal shift. He didn't explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He didn't explain why nobody ages, or why the show has become progressively more surreal and detached from reality with each passing decade, following precisely the arc you'd expect from a dream being generated by a brain that's slowly deteriorating. He just said it wasn't true, and the conversation moved on. The fans didn't move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever managed to do. It makes the show make sense. All of it. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity appearances, the increasingly impossible plots, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, leaving every catastrophe forgotten by the time the next story begins. The fact that Homer can survive anything, recover from anything, walk away from anything, because he's not actually surviving anything. His body is in a hospital bed, only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind, which is the one telling the story, cannot kill him, because killing him would end the dream. And here's the part that stays with you after you've put the theory away and tried to go back to watching the show normally. If this theory is true, then The Simpsons is not a comedy. It is a tragedy. One of the saddest stories ever told in the medium of animation. Because Homer's deepest wish, the thing that his unconscious mind returns to again and again across hundreds of episodes, is extraordinarily simple. He wants his family. That's the whole thing. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, impossible, beloved little boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone in her room. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in one arm. He wants Friday night at the Simpsons house to last forever. He wants beer that's cold and a couch that's soft and the sound of people he loves in the rooms around him. And in the coma, he gets all of that. The dream gives him everything he wants. His children preserved exactly as they were. His wife exactly as he last saw her. His life running on a loop that never reaches the part where things fall apart or people leave, or time takes what it always eventually takes. Homer's coma isn't a nightmare. Under this theory, it's the only heaven a man like Homer would ever ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace, kids who are always young, beer that's always cold, nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every time the credits roll and everything resets, every time some catastrophic event is forgotten by the next episode and Springfield wakes up clean and unchanged, it's not lazy writing. It's Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because the story ending means waking up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed in the real world while he was gone. How old his children really are. Whether anyone is still sitting beside his bed, or whether the room is empty and has been empty for a long time. The coma theory makes every episode an act of love. A man dreaming about his family because they are the only thing worth dreaming about. And if you watch the show through that lens, if you let yourself feel what it's actually describing underneath all the jokes and the chaos and the strangling gags, it is one of the most quietly heartbreaking things in the history of American television. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? We know the official answer. The show told us in September of 1995, after one of the longest and most elaborate narrative buildups in the history of animated television. The shooter was Maggie Simpson, baby Maggie, the pacifier-sucking 1-year-old who couldn't reliably stand upright without assistance, let alone aim and fire a handgun with enough accuracy to put a bullet into the chest of the richest man in Springfield. That's the official answer. The show committed to it. The writers stand behind it. The DVD commentary treats it as settled business. But the more carefully you look at the evidence, the less settled it becomes. Let's go back to the summer of 1995. Because to understand why the official answer doesn't fully satisfy, you have to understand the scale of the event it was supposed to resolve. The show's creators did something that had never been attempted by an animated series before. They constructed a genuine mystery, a whodunit with clues, red herrings, multiple suspects, and a national audience invited to participate in solving it. Fox promoted the 2-part episode the way major networks promote cultural events, not entertainment. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, treating the fictional crime as though it were an actual unsolved case. Viewers across the country were invited to submit their guesses in a contest, with the winner to be animated into a future episode of the show. The mystery was simple on the surface. Mr. Burns had gone too far. He had stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget. He had shut down Moe's Tavern by bankrupting its owner. He had created a sinkhole that destroyed the retirement home where Grandpa Simpson lived. He had injured Santa's little helper, the family dog. And then, as his grand finale, he had constructed a massive mechanical disc and deployed it to block out the sun over Springfield, forcing every resident to purchase their electricity from his plant or sit in darkness. When Smithers, his assistant, protested, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of Part 1, every single person in Springfield had a reason to want Charles Montgomery Burns dead or disabled. The episode took its time making this clear. Homer, because Burns had never once remembered his name despite years of employment. Bart and Lisa, because the school had been financially gutted. Grandpa, because his retirement home had been destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he'd lost his job. Sideshow Mel and Tito Puente, because the music program at the school had been cut. Moe, because his bar had gone under. Smithers, freshly fired and spiraling. Every character with a speaking role in the Springfield ensemble had suffered some direct harm at Burns's hands. They gathered at a public meeting. Multiple characters were shown holding weapons. The tension built to something genuinely cinematic for an animated sitcom. And then Burns appeared. And then a single gunshot. Burns staggered out into the Springfield town square, collapsed onto the sundial, and his hands landed on 2 letters, W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective, looking upward at the dial from below, M and S. The ambulance came, the screen went dark. America spent an entire summer wondering. When Part 2 arrived in September, the investigation played out as a comedic procedural. Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police worked through suspects with their characteristic ineptitude. Smithers confessed immediately, but his confession fell apart when it emerged that he had been so thoroughly blackout drunk on the night of the shooting that he'd actually shot a completely different person in a completely different location, hitting old Jasper in his wooden leg. The police eliminated suspects one by one. Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente had arguably the greatest alibi in the history of television, a full musical number in which he explained that he had channeled his rage into a samba rather than violence. The investigation stalled. Then a key piece of physical evidence emerged, an eyelash found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis was run. The eyelash belonged to a Simpson. Homer, who had the clearest motive of anyone in town and whose fingerprints were found on the gun, was arrested and nearly convicted. Then Burns woke from his coma, looked around the hospital room, and identified his attacker, Maggie Simpson. In the parking lot after the town meeting, Burns had attempted to take her lollipop. His gun fell from its holster during the struggle. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Except almost nobody guessed it. This is the detail about the contest that tends to get lost in the shuffle of the official narrative. Fox held a national competition. Thousands upon thousands of entries were submitted, and according to the DVD commentary for both episodes, not a single person in the randomly selected sample of entries provided the correct answer. Nobody won. The designated winner was chosen at random from the submissions, and because they hadn't guessed correctly, they received a cash payment rather than the animated appearance that was originally promised. The prize itself had to be redesigned because the answer eluded the entire contest pool. The show's writers, in that same commentary, acknowledged that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online to a Simpsons news group on the night of the original broadcast. But this person had posted from a college internet account. By the time the contest concluded and the production team tried to locate them, the account no longer existed. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for the person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what that means for a moment. The show's creators promoted a mystery specifically designed to be solvable from the clues embedded in Part 1. They invited the public to solve it. They held a contest with real prizes, and when the answer came out, essentially the entire viewing population of America had failed to deduce it from the available evidence. Either the clues were genuinely insufficient to lead a reasonable viewer to the correct conclusion, or the answer didn't logically follow from the evidence in the way the promotional material had claimed it would. Now look at the actual evidence, and decide for yourself. Burns falls on the sundial. His hands land on the letters W and S, which from his upward-facing perspective would appear as M and S. The show tells us this stands for Maggie Simpson. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. The clue, the central piece of physical evidence that the show uses to support its official resolution, is the sundial. It is the visual that dominated promotional materials for the entire summer. And Burns himself, in the episode, states explicitly that his hands landing on those letters was not intentional. He didn't deliberately position himself to spell out his attacker's initials. He just fell. He was shot and he staggered and he fell and his hands landed where they landed. The central clue in the show's most famous mystery was explicitly described by the victim as an accident. Then there's the gun. Burns carried a gun in a holster. At some point before the shooting, the holster is shown empty. Burns no longer had his gun on his person when he left the town meeting. Whoever shot him used his own weapon. This means the shooter wasn't someone who came to the meeting armed and planning to act. It was someone who encountered Burns's gun by chance, after it had already fallen or been removed from its holster, and used it impulsively. That narrows the field considerably. Most of the suspects had brought their own weapons to the meeting. They'd come prepared for potential violence. The person who shot Burns with Burns's own gun is someone who wasn't planning to shoot anyone that night, whose encounter with the weapon was unplanned, whose action was reactive rather than premeditated. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits that profile. So does a dozen other characters who weren't carrying weapons that evening. Burns's last words before being shot were, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker, not with surprise or fear, but with a kind of weary recognition. The way you'd acknowledge someone you know but weren't expecting to see. The way you'd greet someone who isn't a threat to you, which is why there's no urgency in those words, no alarm. Does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? The show doesn't establish any meaningful relationship between them prior to this moment. Burns barely recognizes Homer, who has worked for him for years. Homer brings the plant donuts. Homer attends company functions. Homer interacts with Burns on a semi-regular basis, and Burns still can't remember his name. The idea that Burns would look at a baby in the dark in a parking lot after a chaotic town meeting and say, "Oh, it's you," with the casual recognition of an acquaintance, is difficult to square with the character as established by 35 previous episodes. In Season 18, Homer casually states that he was the one who shot Burns. He just says it, out loud, on camera, and nobody reacts, nobody investigates, nobody reopens the case. Homer Simpson confesses to the attempted murder of the richest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is within the range of his established behavior, or the original verdict was wrong and Homer knows it because he's the one who actually pulled the trigger. The Marge theory has its own dedicated following, and the case for it is surprisingly strong. Marge had watched Burns systematically dismantle her family's quality of life. The school her children attended had been financially gutted. Her family's dog had been injured. Her father-in-law's home had been destroyed. And the man responsible had just stolen the sun from her entire town. Marge is, across the show's run, the character with the most finely calibrated protective instinct. She absorbs enormous amounts of stress and difficulty without breaking, but when the people she loves are in direct danger, she acts with a speed and decisiveness that other characters rarely match. The theorist who first articulated the Marge argument also pointed to an episode in which Burns developed a romantic infatuation with Marge. The suggestion is that this unresolved feeling explains why Burns, when he regained consciousness and had the opportunity to identify his attacker, did not name her. He protected her. He took the bullet, literally and figuratively, and when the time came to point the finger, he pointed it at the easiest, most prosecutably inconvenient target available, a baby. Chief Wiggum said it himself. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Even within the context of an attempted murder investigation, Maggie was uniquely useful as a suspect because she could be identified, blamed, and then allowed to continue her life without consequence. No trial. No sentencing. No accountability. The case closes. The truth, whatever it was, gets buried under the official answer. The alternate endings that the writers produced and animated during the production process add another layer to all of this. A complete alternative conclusion was filmed and finished, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. Full-length, fully voiced, professionally produced, this alternate ending was later shown on a clip show hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses the Smithers ending by noting that accepting it would require ignoring all the Simpson DNA evidence, which would be downright nutty. That line, specifically, is a reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which had concluded shortly before the episode aired. A trial in which a jury did, in fact, choose to disregard substantial DNA evidence in reaching their verdict. The show was winking at its audience. It was telling you, using one of the most famous real-world examples available, that DNA evidence gets ignored all the time. That official verdicts don't always reflect the truth. That the answer the jury delivers and the answer that actually happened are sometimes two very different things. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers seriously considered this option for a period of time, primarily because they weren't sure what else to do with Barney's character. They planned to send him to prison. This was eventually abandoned, but its existence tells you something important. The answer was never predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted and fitted around whatever answer the writers eventually settled on. The mystery, which was promoted to the public as solvable from the evidence in Part 1, was reverse-engineered. The clues weren't designed to lead you to the answer. The answer was designed to accommodate the clues. And then there's the final shot of Part 2. Everyone has left the hospital room. Maggie is alone. She looks around the room slowly, deliberately, making sure that no one remains. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that unmistakably mimics pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as confirmation. Maggie did it, and she knows she did. But you could just as easily read it the other way. A baby watching something happen and then imitating it, the way babies imitate everything they observe. Maggie wasn't confessing. She was remembering. She saw someone shoot Burns that night. She's replaying it, the way a child replays any experience that left a strong enough impression. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The writers stand behind it. It's in the reference books and the episode guide and the DVD commentary. But the contest nobody won, the clue that Burns himself described as meaningless, the alternate endings that were fully produced, Homer's unreacted to confession in a later season, and that final ambiguous shot of Maggie in an empty room all suggest the same thing. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was never actually solved. It was closed. Which, in Springfield, has always been a very different thing. Number. Section 4. The Immortality of Mr. Burns. How old is Mr. Burns? The show has answered this question many times, and every answer has been different. But across all of them, across every version of the timeline that the show has ever floated, one thing remains constant. Charles Montgomery Burns was born a very long time ago. His birth has been placed, depending on the episode, somewhere in the range of the late 1800s. He has described personal memories from the years before the turn of the 20th century. He has told stories, in the first person, about events from the 1910s and the 1920s. He has described knowing Howard Hughes. He has described attending Yale. He has described serving in the Second World War, though his role in that conflict was, by any reasonable moral assessment, not one that would appear favorably in a history book. By the most conservative reading of the available evidence, Burns is over 100 years old. By a more liberal reading of the show's various contradictory timelines, he might be approaching 140, and he doesn't merely exist. He doesn't sit in a nursing home with a blanket over his legs, watching the world pass through a window. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal elections. He engineers schemes that require detailed long-term planning, a thorough understanding of modern finance and technology, and a strategic intelligence that nobody else in Springfield can match. His body is frail, there's no question about that. His physical strength is so minimal that he regularly struggles to perform basic tasks. He once couldn't manage to lift a baby bird, but his mind is sharp, razor sharp, ruthlessly, precisely sharp. Burns is arguably the most cognitively capable character in the entire show, operating with a cold, strategic intelligence that his advanced age has apparently done nothing to dull. Which raises the obvious question, how? The show addresses this, obliquely, in the same episode where Homer mistakes Burns for an alien. We've established the outlines of this already, but let's slow down and really examine it, because the details of Burns's medical regimen are important. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment. Not monthly, not annually, weekly. The regimen is described as so intensive, so saturated with chemicals and radiation therapy that after each session, Burns's body produces a visible green glow. He leaves the treatment facility in a dazed, euphoric state and wanders through the woods near Springfield until the effects settle. Without the treatment, delivered on a precise weekly schedule, Burns would be dead within 7 days. The margin of error is 0. Miss one appointment, and the man dies. His life is maintained not through any natural biological process, but through scheduled artificial intervention. The same way you maintain a machine, the same way you service an engine. His body is kept running by external inputs that substitute for whatever biological functions his system can no longer perform on its own. And the treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who built a nuclear power plant. The man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's ecosystem for decades. The man who has spent a century in closer proximity to nuclear material than almost any civilian in the country. Burns isn't just profiting from radiation. Burns is powered by it. His body has been so thoroughly altered by decades of nuclear exposure that it can no longer sustain its own biological functions without periodic radiation inputs. Take them away, and the whole system collapses. There's another piece of the Burns medical picture that the show presents as comedy, but lands very differently once you've sat with it for a while. Burns visits a doctor at some point in the series. The doctor performs a comprehensive examination and delivers his findings. Burns, the doctor explains, has every disease known to medical science. Every single one. Simultaneously. The full catalog. Ailments that ordinarily don't coexist within a single human body are all present in Burns's system at once, and the reason they haven't killed him is that they're all competing. Each disease is fighting for dominance, but because they're all present at the same time, they create a kind of biological gridlock. None of them can progress, because each one is being blocked by all the others. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome, comparing the situation to 3 people trying to fit through a doorway at once. None of them can get through. Burns's diseases are all trying to kill him simultaneously, and the result of their collective effort is that none of them can. The doctor concludes that Burns is the sickest man in the United States, but functionally indestructible because everything that should kill him is blocked by everything else that should kill him. This is played as one of the show's most beloved throwaway gags. But if you accept the radiation theory, If you accept that Burns's weekly treatments are not just keeping him alive, but actively managing the disease equilibrium that the doctor describes, then this scene is not a joke. It's a description of a medical maintenance protocol of breathtaking complexity. The treatments don't cure Burns's diseases. They don't eliminate them. They keep every illness in perfect stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining enough dominance to kill him. It's not medicine in any conventional sense. It's nuclear maintenance applied to a human body. Burns's body is, in the most literal possible sense, a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. Smithers's role in all of this is not emotional. Or rather, it's not only emotional. The show has spent decades building the relationship between Smithers and Burns as one of unrequited devotion. Smithers loves his employer with an intensity that clearly goes beyond professional loyalty. This is true. But underneath the love, underneath the devotion, there is a purely practical component that the show rarely makes explicit. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures that Burns makes every weekly treatment appointment without exception. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that the show occasionally presents as obsessive, but that becomes entirely rational once you understand what's at stake. If Smithers ever left, if he were removed from his position or chose to walk away, Burns would miss a treatment. And if Burns missed a treatment, the disease equilibrium would collapse. Without the weekly radiation input holding everything in balance, every illness in Burns's body would surge simultaneously. The Three Stooges would stop trying to push through the doorway at the same time and start taking turns, and Burns would die. Smithers isn't devoted to Burns purely out of love. He's devoted because he understands, at a level perhaps no one else in Springfield does, that his presence is keeping a very old and very complicated man alive. His absence would be a death sentence. And that knowledge, the knowledge that he is functionally necessary to Burns's continued existence, is the foundation of the entire relationship. It gives Smithers a power that the show almost never acknowledges directly. He could walk out of Burns's life and Burns would be dead within a week. He chooses not to. Every single day, he chooses not to. And Burns, for all his contempt and his condescension and his casual cruelty, is entirely dependent on that choice. Burns's connection to historical events adds a layer to the immortality question that the show has never quite committed to examining directly. The things Burns claims to have personally witnessed or participated in span over a century of American history. He attended Yale during an era when the institution was significantly different from what it is today. He served in a world war with what sounds like direct, first-hand experience of its events. He knew and had dealings with historical figures who died decades before any of Springfield's other residents were born. He references the Gilded Age not as a period he learned about in school, but as something he lived through personally. The Burns family fortune, as the show describes it, predates many of the institutions that currently govern American life. It is not new money or even generational wealth in the conventional sense. It is ancient money. Money that has been accumulating and compounding for so long that its origins are obscure even to the people who now hold it. The Burns dynasty, such as the show establishes it, extends back centuries. They were the kind of wealthy that shapes the infrastructure of a nation and then charges everyone else to use it. And the current Burns, Charles Montgomery, has been managing and extending that legacy for well over 100 years. There is a question buried here that the show has never answered and has never appeared especially interested in answering. Is Burns unique? Is he a singular anomaly? A man who stumbled onto a method of artificial life extension that happens to align with his ownership of a nuclear facility? Or is there something in the Burns family history that suggests this has happened before? Did previous generations of the dynasty find their own methods of extending their grasp on power beyond what normal human lifespans would allow? The show doesn't say, but it does establish, clearly and consistently, that the Burns family has maintained continuous control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity doesn't emerge from normal generational succession. It requires something more. Burns's relationship with death itself is worth examining separately from his relationship with aging. He has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show. He has been shot. He has been hospitalized dozens of times over. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been left in the wilderness to fend for himself. And every single time, he comes back. Not the way Homer comes back from physical trauma through some supernatural cartoon resilience. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of wealth that ensures no matter what happens to his physical body, that someone will be standing by with the resources and the expertise to put him back together. Homer's survival of impossible events is passive. He endures. He bounces back. He gets up and shakes it off because the show needs him alive, and so he is. Burns's survival is engineered. He has spent more than a century building a system whose central purpose is to ensure that he does not die. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has ever purchased influence over, every doctor he has ever retained, every politician he has ever funded, every lawyer he has ever kept on retainer, all of it serves this single purpose: keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming, keep the diseases balanced, keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, his empire dies with him, and empires of that age and that scale don't allow themselves to die if they can possibly help it. The truly unsettling part of the Burns immortality question isn't the longevity itself, it's the feedback loop that sustains it. Burns owns the power plant. The power plant provides Springfield's electricity. Springfield's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant's continued operation depends on Burns. Burns's continued existence depends on the treatments. The treatments depend on the infrastructure that Burns's wealth provides. Every element of this system feeds every other element. It is a closed loop, self-sustaining. And the people of Springfield are inside that loop, breathing the air it produces and drinking the water it generates and paying their electricity bills to the man at the center of it. Springfield can't kill Burns because Springfield can't survive without Burns. Burns can't die because dying would mean the system he built finally has to answer for what it's done to the people who have lived inside it for decades. He's not immortal exactly. Immortality implies something effortless, something supernatural. This is neither of those things. This is a very old, very sick, very rich man who has spent his entire extremely long life building and maintaining a machine whose entire purpose is to ensure that he stays alive. He's too expensive to die, and Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as the lights stay on. Number. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper Springfield's Collective Denial. Most people who remember this episode remember it as the moment the Simpsons betrayed them. It aired on the 28th of September 1997, Season 9, Episode 2. The Principal and the Pauper. And the backlash was immediate. It was fierce. It has never fully subsided. 28 years later, fans still cite it as the moment the show stopped caring about its own continuity. The moment the writers broke a foundational rule of the fictional world they'd spent 8 seasons building. But here's the interpretation that almost nobody considers: what if this episode didn't break The Simpsons? What if it was the only episode that was brave enough to show you exactly what The Simpsons had always been? Let's set the scene carefully. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner for 20 years of service to the school. During the ceremony, a stranger walks in. Nobody recognizes him. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was believed dead after being captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia. He survived his captivity. He escaped. He made his way home. And when he arrived, he discovered that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner for 2 decades is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armand Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street kid, a petty criminal from the wrong side of any available track, with no prospects and no particular future. He was drafted into the army, ended up in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news to Skinner's mother, Agnes. When he arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never in his life had a family or a home or an identity worth keeping, just went along with it. He stepped into Seymour Skinner's life and wore it for 20 years. He took the name, the rank, the mother, the career, the community, the entire accumulated identity of a man he'd watched be captured by enemy forces and presumed dead. He lived inside that stolen life with such thoroughness that nobody ever questioned it. For 2 decades. Until the real Skinner walked through the door. Now, here's what happens next. Here's the part that made audiences furious and critics reach for their sharpest pens. The town holds a meeting. The real Seymour Skinner is present. Armand Tamzarian is present. The truth has been fully exposed. Every adult in Springfield knows that their principal is a fraud. And rather than debating what to do about the crime that has been committed, rather than discussing accountability or restoration, or any of the mechanisms that communities typically deploy when a major public figure is revealed to have been living a fabricated identity, the town votes. Not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on whether to restore the real Skinner's identity and his rightful place in the community he was taken from. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree stating that the imposter is, from this moment forward, the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life stolen, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from the town. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention what really happened. Harry Shearer, who voices both Skinner and Burns, publicly criticized the episode. Critics called it a betrayal of the character's established backstory. Audiences reacted with something close to outrage. The episode consistently ranks among the worst in the series in fan polls. It has become shorthand, in discussions of Simpsons history, for the moment the show lost its respect for its own continuity. But everything fans hated about this episode is what makes it the most honest piece of television the show ever produced. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The town has always collectively agreed to forget whatever doesn't serve the agreed-upon version of reality. The only thing this episode does differently is show you the mechanics of that agreement in real time. It shows you the meeting. It shows you the vote. It shows you the legal decree. It shows you the actual, literal expulsion of truth from the community. The real Skinner tied to a train and removed from a town that has decided it has no room for him. Every other time Springfield forgets something it should remember, every other catastrophe that gets reset by the next episode, every other world-altering event that disappears from the collective memory by the following Sunday night, it happens off-screen. You don't see the mechanism. You just notice the absence of consequence. The Principal and the Pauper is the only episode that lets you watch the mechanism operate in real time. Consider the list of things Springfield has experienced and then forgotten. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been invaded. It has been sealed under a glass dome by the federal government. It has survived nuclear near misses and environmental catastrophes and encounters with what might be extraterrestrial life. It has had its sun blocked out by a billionaire's machine, and every single time by the next episode, everything is normal. Nobody references what happened. The slate is clean. The world resets. Fans call this episodic storytelling, a production convention of American television in which each episode is designed to stand alone, without requiring the viewer to have seen previous installments. This is a real thing. It's a real convention, and it applies to The Simpsons with unusual consistency. But The Principal and the Pauper offers a different explanation, one rooted in the show's own logic. Springfield resets because the people of Springfield choose to reset. Collectively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that says, we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. We will treat the comfortable lie as truth, and we will treat the inconvenient truth as a criminal act. And anyone who breaks this contract, anyone who insists on telling the real version of events, will be removed from the community. That isn't a cartoon narrative device. That's how real communities work. Small towns in particular have a documented capacity for collective amnesia. Scandals get buried. Crimes disappear from the official record. Uncomfortable events get rewritten until the manufactured version is the only version anyone can reliably recall. The community closes around a shared narrative the way a wound closes around a foreign object, sealing it in rather than expelling it. The Principal and the Pauper didn't break The Simpsons. It diagnosed Springfield. It showed you that the town's amnesia isn't a side effect of 36 seasons of episodic storytelling. It's a feature. It's a defense mechanism employed by a population that has a very specific reason to avoid confronting the truth about their situation. Because the truth, if followed to its logical conclusions, leads somewhere the town cannot afford to go. Follow the chain of reasoning. If Springfield's residents acknowledged the full scope of the environmental contamination coming from the nuclear plant, they would have to confront the plant itself. If they confronted the plant, they would have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns, the economic foundation of the entire town would be at risk. And if the economy collapsed, the town dies. Not metaphorically. The town actually ceases to function as a community. So they don't acknowledge the contamination. They don't confront the plant. They don't challenge Burns. They look at a three-eyed fish and decide not to ask the obvious question about what's producing three-eyed fish. And when someone arrives who insists on asking that question, who shows up with evidence that the official version of events is wrong, the community's response is not gratitude. It is expulsion. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's most honest man. He came home from a prison camp with the truth in his hands, and the town tied him to a train. Because in Springfield, the truth is something you can be prosecuted for when the truth is inconvenient enough to the people who benefit from the lie. Now connect this to the coma theory, and the story gets darker still. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented this scenario. His dreaming brain constructed a story in which an entire community votes to sustain a false identity rather than acknowledge the real one, in which a stolen life can become a legal life through collective agreement, in which the imposter's version of reality wins simply because enough people choose to believe in it. Homer needs to believe this. He needs to believe that lies can be maintained, that stolen identities can become real through community consensus, that the fake version of a life can hold together if enough people agree to stop asking questions. Because that's what his coma is. A fake life replacing a real one. A dream running in the place of an actual existence. And as long as nobody in the dream questions it, as long as Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction, Homer doesn't have to wake up and find out how much time has actually passed. The Principal and the Pauper is the infrastructure episode, the one that shows you how the whole machine works, how Springfield maintains its impossible reality, how every reset gets collectively approved, how every uncomfortable truth gets expelled on a train car. It's not the worst episode, it's the most important one, because once you've seen the mechanism, you can't unsee it. Every other episode in which something catastrophic happens and is then forgotten looks different. Every reset has a vote behind it. Every piece of forgetting is a deliberate act, and Armin Tamzarian is still living as Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner is still out there somewhere, exiled from his own name. And the town that made honesty illegal is still running the same school, with the same principal, and nobody is allowed to notice that any of this is strange. That's Springfield. That's the social contract that makes everything else in this town possible. Section 6. Maggie Simpson. The silent genius. Maggie Simpson doesn't talk. She has been alive for 36 years. She has been present in hundreds of episodes. She has been photographed, animated, drawn, referenced, and considered from every possible angle that a supporting character in a long-running animated series can be considered. She has one confirmed word to her credit, spoken once, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor, and never repeated. She communicates through pacifier noises and the occasional pointed stare. She is, by the show's own accounting, 1 year old. And in that time, without saying a word that anyone in Springfield can understand, she has done more than almost any other character in the show's history. She shot a billionaire. She led a daycare rebellion against an authoritarian caretaker. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations through interventions that required planning, timing, and a clarity of purpose that the adult Simpsons rarely manage to achieve. She has been tested for intelligence and found to possess cognitive capabilities that existing instruments cannot adequately measure. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that would be remarkable in an experienced adult, let alone an infant who cannot reliably walk from one end of a room to the other without falling down. And through every single one of these remarkable things, she has not said a word. She has maintained her silence with an absolute, unwavering consistency that, once you start looking at it clearly, stops resembling a developmental pattern and starts resembling a strategy. Let's start with the shooting. We've already examined the who shot Burns mystery from the perspective of the investigation and the evidence. But let's look at the aftermath from Maggie's specific vantage point, because the aftermath is arguably more revealing than the act itself. A baby was identified, investigated, and officially designated as the person who shot the richest man in town. The police looked at her. The FBI looked at her. Burns himself identified her from his hospital bed, and the conclusion was, yes, this infant committed an act of violence against a grown man, and there is nothing the law can do about it. Chief Wiggum's exact words were that no jury in the world would convict a baby, and that was the end of it. Now look at the final shot of that episode one more time. Everybody has left the hospital room. The investigation is over. The case is closed. Maggie is alone in the room. She looks around carefully, deliberately. She checks the corners. She confirms that no one is watching. And then, only once she has verified her solitude, she moves her pacifier in a motion that unmistakably mimics the pulling of a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. Maggie is acknowledging, in the only physical language available to her, what she did. But look at that sequence of actions again with fresh eyes. She looked around to make sure she was alone before performing the gesture. That means she understood that performing the gesture in front of others would have consequences. That means she understood that what she had done, or what she had witnessed, was something that needed to be kept private. That means she understood the concept of privacy, and the concept of consequence, and the difference between behaviors that are safe to perform in public and behaviors that should be reserved for moments of confirmed solitude. Those are not the cognitive capacities of an infant. A 1-year-old does not understand the social implications of a reenacted shooting in the presence of witnesses. A 1-year-old does not check the room before doing something they instinctively understand might be problematic if observed. Those are the cognitive capacities of someone who is aware of her situation, who understands what has happened, and who has made a calculated decision about how to manage information going forward. Now let's look at the Academy Award-nominated theatrical short from 2012, The Longest Daycare. 7 minutes long, produced for cinema, screened before Ice Age Continental Drift. In it, Maggie is dropped off at a daycare facility that runs with the cheerless efficiency of a poorly managed institution. Inside, she encounters a caterpillar that is about to become a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another infant, a bully identified as Gerald, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, evades the daycare staff, navigates the facility's layout, and ultimately succeeds in getting the butterfly safely to the outside world. She accomplishes all of this without speaking a word. She accomplishes it through observation, through planning, through improvisation, and through an adaptive problem-solving approach that the short depicts with a clarity that makes it impossible to dismiss as accidental. She reads the physical environment and assesses its constraints. She identifies threats and assigns them levels of priority. She develops strategies on the fly when initial approaches fail. She executes plans that require precise timing, spatial awareness, and the ability to predict other characters' behaviors accurately enough to build those predictions into her own actions. Her body, limited to the motor capabilities of a 1-year-old, struggles to keep up with her mind. She falls, she stumbles, she crawls when running would be faster. But every decision she makes is correct. Every move she makes is the optimal move available given the information and resources at her disposal. Her intelligence is operating at a level that her physical development simply cannot support. And she succeeds anyway, because her mind compensates for everything her body cannot do. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly, across various episodes, and the results are consistently extraordinary. The numbers vary depending on which episode is doing the measuring, but the pattern is uniform. Maggie registers as cognitively exceptional to a degree that standard instruments are not designed to capture. And the show plays this for quick laughs and moves on, because the show always plays Maggie's capacities for quick laughs and moves on. But the accumulation of evidence across decades of episodes tells a clear story. This is not a normal baby. Now look at Lisa Simpson, because Maggie has been watching Lisa for her entire life, and what she has watched is instructive. Lisa is brilliant. She is genuinely, demonstrably, remarkably intelligent. She has an IQ that places her in a category far above anyone else in her household and far above most of the adults in Springfield. She is curious and principled and motivated by a desire to understand the world and improve it. And what has her intelligence gotten her? Isolation, mockery, repeated, grinding dismissal from the community around her. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. She challenges authority and gets punished. She tries to push the world toward being better and gets crushed by a community that finds her inconvenient. Her intelligence is her greatest quality and her greatest liability, because she deploys it visibly. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room, and the room responds by making sure she knows how little that matters. Maggie has watched this her entire life. She has watched her sister fight every day for recognition and receive nothing but resistance in return. She has watched the most capable person in the family be consistently undermined by a household and a community that are structured to reward compliance and punish insight. And Maggie drew a different conclusion. Not the conclusion Lisa drew, which is to keep fighting regardless of the personal cost. Maggie drew the opposite lesson. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less they notice you, the more freely you can move. The more you look like exactly what everyone expects you to be, a helpless, passive, dependent infant, the less scrutiny you receive. And the less scrutiny you receive, the more space you have to do whatever you actually need to do. Think about the pattern. Every remarkable thing Maggie has ever done has happened below the radar. The shooting investigation focused on every adult in Springfield before anyone seriously considered the baby, because who suspects a baby? The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody monitors infants closely enough to notice when they're organizing. Every heroic act, every display of intelligence, every moment where Maggie's intervention is the difference between disaster and survival, it all happens in the margins, in the spaces where nobody is paying attention. Maggie has created those spaces deliberately. She has maintained the most effective disguise available to her, being exactly what everyone in her family expects a baby to be. Quiet, passive, dependent, requiring care rather than providing it. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them, consistently and deliberately. She is the most capable member of the Simpson family, and she has spent 36 years making sure that nobody figures that out. Now connect this to the radiation theory, because the connection is striking. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates mutations, and if those mutations affect different individuals differently rather than producing uniform effects across the population, then Maggie and Homer represent opposite extremes of the same environmental cause. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to a level that classifies as clinically impaired. Maggie's mutation, the same contamination acting on a different person, amplified her cognitive function to levels that exceed what measurement instruments can capture. Same water, same air, same irradiated environment. But where the father's brain was diminished, the daughter's was enhanced. They're two poles of the same radioactive phenomenon. Homer is what happens when the contamination takes something away. Maggie is what happens when the contamination gives something extraordinary. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius takes on an emotional weight that is almost too heavy to carry comfortably. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since April 1993 is the product of an unconscious mind maintaining a simulation of the family it lost, then Maggie's extraordinary intelligence is not a mutation. It's a father's prayer. Homer cannot see Maggie grow up. He cannot watch her develop. He cannot hear her speak or see her walk or learn what kind of person she becomes as she moves through childhood toward adulthood. He has no reference material for any of that. So in the dream, he gives her something he can control. He makes her exceptional. He makes her capable of anything. He makes her the kind of person who can save herself and her family and anyone who needs saving, even without his help. Because in his coma, Homer needs to believe that Maggie will be okay. He needs to believe that even in his absence, she is protected. Not by him, by her own remarkable, unmeasurable, unreachable mind. Her genius isn't a mutation. Under this reading, it's a father's deepest wish for his youngest child, given form in the only medium available to him. Back in Springfield, if there is a waking Springfield, there's another reading, darker and less comforting. Maggie doesn't speak because she's learned, from careful observation of the world she was born into, that speaking gets you nothing in this town. She doesn't reveal her intelligence because intelligence is a liability in Springfield. She watches everything. She remembers everything. She understands everything. And she waits. For what? The show has never told us. Maggie's endgame is the last truly unsolved mystery of the Simpson family. She's the only character whose future remains completely undefined, because the show has never committed to revealing what she's actually capable of at full deployment. We've seen glimpses. We've seen her shoot a man. We've seen her lead a room full of babies. We've seen her solve problems that stump adults 3 times her age. We've seen her confirm a person's innocence with a single nod, and the family trusts that nod implicitly, without asking for elaboration or evidence. What happens when Maggie decides that silence has served its purpose? What happens when she determines that the moment she's been preparing for has arrived? Nobody in Springfield knows. Nobody in Springfield has even considered the question, because nobody in Springfield suspects that the baby watching everything from behind her pacifier is the most dangerous person on Evergreen Terrace. That's exactly how she designed it, and she's been designing it for 36 years. Number, Section 7. The Predictions Prophecy or Something Stranger. The Simpsons predicted Donald Trump's presidency 16 years before it happened. It predicted the Disney acquisition of Fox. It predicted a smartwatch. It predicted what appears to be the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which wasn't experimentally confirmed until decades after the episode aired. It predicted a pandemic originating in Asia that would cause mass panic and supply chain disruption. It predicted that Cypress Hill would one day perform with the London Symphony Orchestra, 28 years before that collaboration actually occurred. The list goes on. It gets passed around the internet every time a new entry is added to it. The screenshots, the clips, the side-by-side comparisons of a Simpsons frame from 1994 and a news photograph from 2019. The reactions are always the same mixture of amazement and something close to unease. How are they doing this? Are the writers getting information from somewhere they shouldn't? Is there a conspiracy? Is The Simpsons, hiding behind 36 seasons of yellow-skinned cartoon jokes, some kind of encoded prophetic document? Let's take this seriously for a moment, because it deserves to be taken seriously. And then let's go somewhere more interesting than the obvious debunking, because the real explanation for the predictions is more fascinating than any conspiracy theory about time travel or supernatural foreknowledge. Start with the Trump presidency. The episode Bart to the Future aired in the year 2000. It depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. In that same future, references to a Trump presidency in the past serve as the joke premise for the economic situation Lisa inherits. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 election. For the portion of the internet that discovered this clip in 2016 and shared it with breathless incredulity, the coincidence seemed impossible. How could the writers have known? The answer, from the writers themselves, is that they were looking at the present very carefully. By the year 2000, Donald Trump had been a prominent public figure for over 2 decades. He had been publicly flirting with the idea of running for president since at least the late 1980s. The observation that celebrity culture and political culture were converging, that the boundary between entertainment fame and electoral viability was eroding, was not an obscure insight in 2000. It was an observation that a number of cultural commentators were already making. The Simpsons writers, a room full of highly educated observers of American public life, made that observation, extrapolated it to a comedic extreme, and wrote a joke. The joke, 16 years later, turned out to be accurate. But the accuracy was not prophecy. It was extrapolation from a trend that was already visible to anyone paying careful enough attention. The Disney-Fox merger works the same way. When the episode depicting a mega-corporation swallowing its competitors aired in 1998, media consolidation was already a well-established trend in the American entertainment industry. The number of major studios and networks had been shrinking for years. The idea that this consolidation would continue, that the largest players would keep absorbing smaller ones until a handful of enormous companies controlled most of what the American public watched, was not a radical or counterintuitive forecast. It was an extrapolation of an existing direction, taken to an absurd but not illogical conclusion. The Simpsons writing staff has been, for most of the show's history, one of the most academically credentialed rooms in television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other elite universities. Many have backgrounds not just in comedy writing but in mathematics, physics, computer science, and political theory. The Homer and Lisa equation that appears to approximate the mass of the Higgs boson particle was written by a writer with a deep background in mathematics who was constructing what he knew to be a real and meaningful mathematical relationship. He wasn't guessing. He was applying actual knowledge of physics to a joke format, and the result was something that turned out to be closer to correct than most casual observers of the scene would have expected. These aren't lucky guesses from people throwing darts at a board. These are intelligent, well-read observers of American culture and science who spent their careers studying trends, analyzing patterns, and extrapolating current trajectories to their logical conclusions. They read the present more carefully than most people do, and then they push it forward a few steps, and they call the result a joke. The joke occasionally turns out to be where reality was already heading. Al Jean, who has run the show as executive producer for most of its later seasons, addressed the prediction phenomenon with characteristic directness. His explanation was simple. If you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, statistical probability alone guarantees that some of it will align with future events. This isn't a mysterious phenomenon. It's arithmetic. Producer Bill Oakley, who oversaw some of the show's most celebrated seasons, was even more blunt. There are very few cases where The Simpsons genuinely predicted something, he said. Most of it is coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history repeats itself. That's the official position from inside the room where the predictions were made. Coincidence, statistical volume, and the cyclical nature of human events. Fact-checking organizations have systematically worked through the most popular prediction claims and found mundane explanations for the majority of them. Many of the supposed predictions involve trends that were already clearly underway when the episodes were written. The writers weren't seeing the future. They were seeing the present and following its trajectory to conclusions that hadn't arrived yet. But then you look at the specific cases, and something shifts. The Trump episode didn't just predict that a celebrity with a talent for spectacle might eventually run for president. It specified Trump, by name. And in a later episode depicting Trump's campaign announcement, there's a visual sequence showing him descending an escalator in a way that echoes the real-world announcement he made in 2015, right down to specific compositional elements. That's not a vague trend extrapolation. That's a specific detail aligning with a specific future event in a way that statistical probability starts to feel inadequate to explain. The Siegfried and Roy episode doesn't just make a joke about exotic animals being unpredictable. It depicts a white tiger attacking one of the performers, which is almost exactly what happened in October 2003, when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers during a live performance. The general observation that working with large predators is dangerous is not a bold prediction, but specifying the white tiger and the attack and the performer brings it into a different category. These aren't vague trend extrapolations. These are specific details that align with future events in ways that make you slow down and look at them twice. And this is where the most interesting theory about the predictions lies. Not the conspiracy theories about time travel or secret knowledge. Something more subtle and more genuinely thought-provoking. The Simpsons doesn't predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it, not through magic or prophecy or any kind of metaphysical mechanism, through cultural influence. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in history. It has been running continuously for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have become part of the American cultural vocabulary. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand and describe their own world. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point, a touchstone, something that gets mentioned at parties and shared online and recalled when Trump appears in the news. The joke doesn't predict the outcome. The joke makes the outcome feel familiar before it arrives. It primes the cultural imagination. It takes an idea, a celebrity businessman becoming president, and it makes that idea feel less like an impossible absurdity and more like an obvious joke. And once an idea feels like an obvious joke, it doesn't feel shocking anymore when it materializes. It feels like recognition. We've seen this. The Simpsons already did this. The show didn't predict the Disney acquisition of Fox. The show made media consolidation feel like an inevitable punchline years before the punchline arrived. And when Disney actually bought Fox, the cultural reaction wasn't shock. It was resigned familiarity. Of course they did. The Simpsons already told us this would happen. The show's satire doesn't forecast the future. It normalizes futures that are already in motion, makes them feel like accomplished facts before they've become facts. And when reality catches up to the joke, the audience experiences a sense of having been here before that feels like prophecy, but is actually the result of having been culturally prepared for the outcome years in advance. Springfield doesn't reflect America. Over 36 years of continuous broadcast, America has gradually come to resemble Springfield. The show held up a mirror for long enough that we started to recognize ourselves in it. The nuclear power plant run by a corrupt billionaire, the incompetent government, The population too distracted by entertainment and petty concerns to notice how thoroughly they're being exploited. The cycle of catastrophe and reset. The collective amnesia that allows the same mistakes to recur without consequence. Springfield isn't a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was, delivered weekly for 3.5 decades, until the patient started looking in the mirror and saying, "I suppose that does look a bit like me." And here's the final layer, the one that makes the prediction phenomenon genuinely strange even after you've accepted the statistical and cultural explanations. The Simpsons has also made predictions that didn't come true, thousands of them. Jetpacks and moon colonies and technologies that never materialized. Political outcomes that went the other way, cultural shifts that failed to arrive on schedule. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody builds viral posts around the predictions that missed. Nobody tracks the failure rate, because confirmation bias operates in one direction only. We remember the hits, we forget the misses. And when you apply that filter to 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations and then curate only the accurate ones for the cultural record, you end up with a highlight reel that looks, from the outside, like prophecy. The predictions aren't supernatural, but they're not nothing either. They're the result of brilliant, educated, deeply observant people writing about American culture for 36 years, following trends to their conclusions, putting specific details in their jokes, because specific details are funnier than vague generalities, and then having that vast body of material filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever built, which is the internet. The ones that landed are the ones anyone remembers. The ones that missed are gone. 800 episodes, 36 years, and enough bullseyes to make the show's own writers pause occasionally and wonder if they know something they shouldn't. Even knowing how the trick works, even after the statistical explanation and the cultural influence explanation and the confirmation bias explanation, there are moments where the alignment is precise enough that it stops feeling comfortable. And maybe that discomfort is the point. Maybe Springfield is telling us something that we know intellectually but resist accepting emotionally. That the future is not as unpredictable as we'd like it to be. That the patterns are visible if you look at them clearly. That the trends tell you where things are heading if you follow them honestly. That the world is, in a meaningful sense, more legible than we find comfortable to admit. And that sometimes a cartoon from 1997, written by people who were simply paying attention, can tell you something true about what's coming in 2025? Not because they're prophets, because they were watching. And most of us weren't. Number. Section 8. Mona Simpson and the Conspiracy That Broke 3 Generations. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told his son at some point during Homer's childhood that his mother had passed away. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned, in the vague and largely unexplored way that a child whose parent is presented as a historical fact rather than an immediate loss tends to mourn. He grew up believing he was a boy whose mother had died young, whose father was cold and distant and incapable of filling the void she left, and whose fundamental emotional architecture had been shaped by that absence. Look at Homer's personality through this lens and it reframes almost everything. His desperate need for love and approval, his terror of being abandoned by the people he cares about, his willingness to absorb humiliation from employers, from neighbors, from strangers, rather than risk losing the stability of the relationships he's built, his compulsive need to be liked by everyone around him, not in a casual way but with an intensity that suggests something fundamental in his psychology is seeking something it never found. His clinginess toward Marge, which the show has always played as endearing but which, examined carefully, looks like the attachment pattern of someone who has learned, at a very deep level, that the people who love you have a tendency to disappear. Homer Simpson's entire personality is a coping mechanism, and it took season 7 to reveal what it was coping for. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired on the 19th of November, 1995, and it is consistently regarded as one of the greatest single episodes the show has ever produced. The events are set in motion when Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, which eventually leads Marge to insist he go to the Hall of Records and correct the municipal record that now lists him as deceased. When Homer arrives at the records office, he finds something that changes everything he thought he knew about his own life. According to official documentation, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him wasn't hers. It was, of all things, the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe Simpson had been pointing at a famous American writer's headstone and telling his son it was his mother's burial site for Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She doesn't recognize him at first. He's grown. He's become the person he became in her absence. But when Homer proves who he is, they have a reunion that is one of the most genuinely affecting scenes in the show's long history. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona explains why she left. She didn't die. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she had to. Because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who now employs Homer, the man Homer has been working for his entire adult life without ever connecting the biographical dots, had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife, married to Abe, mother to young Homer, living a quiet, ordinary life in Springfield while the world outside was tearing itself apart over Vietnam and civil rights and the counterculture. She was unremarkable, conventional, nobody who would have appeared in any history of the period. Then something changed. The show depicts her radicalization with a mixture of absurdity and genuine emotional honesty. Mona became politically active. She joined a group of activists, hippies in the show's shorthand, though the show also makes clear that their cause was legitimate. They targeted a laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Not the nuclear power plant, a different facility, a germ warfare laboratory, a facility designed to produce biological weapons, located in or near Springfield, operated by the same man who would later build the nuclear plant with 342 safety violations. Let that land for a moment. Burns didn't just run a nuclear power plant with catastrophic safety violations. He also ran a biological weapons laboratory. In Springfield, where people were raising families and sending children to school and drinking the tap water and generally attempting to live normal lives without knowing that the richest man in town was producing weaponizable pathogens down the road. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological material stored inside. During the raid, as the group fled the facility, Mona stopped. She stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos of the escape. That someone was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact Abe. She couldn't hold her son or explain to him why she was leaving, or assure him that the departure had nothing to do with him. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and disappeared into the night. She didn't see him again for 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Now trace the conspiracy that extends from that night. Burns didn't just report Mona to the FBI and move on. He maintained an active interest in her capture for decades. When Mona returns to Springfield in the season 7 episode, Burns spots her through a cab window and immediately contacts the authorities. The FBI appears at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer, who has just found his mother after 27 years, has to say goodbye to her again. This time he knows why she left, he knows who forced her out, and he knows that the person responsible is his own employer. Homer works for Charles Montgomery Burns. Homer has been working for him for his entire adult life. Homer earns his paycheck from the man who took his mother from him when he was a child, who has been actively pursuing her capture for decades, who has been signing Homer's checks while simultaneously ensuring that Homer can never have his family whole. And Homer doesn't connect the dots. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't quit. He doesn't even seem to fully process the relationship between these two facts about his life. The show doesn't play this for comedy. It plays it as tragedy. Because Homer's inability to make this connection isn't stupidity in the cartoon sense, it's the result of decades of cognitive erosion. The crayon, the radiation, the accumulated damage of living in Springfield's contaminated environment. Homer's brain does not work in ways that allow him to see the architecture of his own situation. The connections that would be obvious to an undamaged mind are simply not available to him. That's the deepest layer of the conspiracy. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life and then move on. He engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged in very specific ways, desperate for approval. pathologically afraid of abandonment, incapable of tolerating conflict with people in authority. These are not random character traits. These are the precise psychological characteristics produced by early childhood maternal loss. And these are the precise characteristics that make Homer the ideal employee for a facility that no competent, self-possessed adult would agree to work at under the conditions Burns maintains. Homer doesn't work at the nuclear plant because he lacks ambition or because he stumbled into the job by accident. Homer works at the nuclear plant because Burns broke him before he was old enough to have a choice about it. And the broken version of Homer is exactly the worker Burns needs. Compliant, obedient, grateful for any fragment of stability or recognition, constitutionally unable to walk away from the only source of security he's ever had. The show confirms this architecture in a later revelation about the relationship between Burns and Abe Simpson. Burns had committed a crime. Abe discovered it. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant, regardless of his performance, regardless of the number of errors he made, regardless of how many times he should have been fired. 742 documented errors, by one accounting. Homer was never permanently let go because a deal struck in secret between his father and his mother's persecutor protected him. Homer's job security wasn't a cartoon convenience or a narrative necessity. It was a contractual obligation between a man keeping secrets and a man who needed those secrets kept. Brokered over Homer's head without Homer's knowledge, maintained through decades of silence, and never explained to Homer because explaining it would have required explaining everything else. His mother's activism, Burns's weapons lab, the FBI's involvement, the 27 years, the whole terrible architecture of it. 3 generations of Simpsons, shaped by one man's decision to pursue a grudge. Mona fought back against something genuinely monstrous and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the person responsible for destroying his family and buried the truth in exchange for his son's economic security. Homer inherited the consequences of both choices without understanding why his life felt the way it did, why it was so heavy, why it was so difficult to hold on to the things he loved, why people always seemed to leave or be taken. The show proved, in the episode where Homer has the crayon removed, that the man Homer might have been still exists somewhere underneath the accumulated damage. Without the crayon, Homer is brilliant and articulate, and capable of engaging with the world at a level he has never achieved before. He sees Springfield clearly, he sees his job clearly, he sees the system he has been living inside for decades, and it is unbearable. So he goes back, he chooses the fog, he chooses not to see, because seeing in Springfield is too expensive, but the choice was always rigged. Homer was never meant to see clearly. Burns made sure of that in 1969, when Mona kissed her sleeping son goodbye and vanished into the night. And the man Homer could have been, the man who existed briefly when the crayon came out, the one who was articulate and funny and genuinely intelligent, that man is still in there. Buried under decades of radiation and a piece of yellow wax and a childhood shaped by an absence he was told was a death. Mona Simpson died in a later season. Her death scene is quiet and devastating in the way that the show's best emotional moments always are. No joke to soften it. No reset. Homer holds her hand and watches her go, and the camera holds on his face, and the weight of 27 stolen years is visible in every frame. The Simpsons is a comedy, and it has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy there is a family that was broken, systematically and deliberately, by a man who found it more convenient to destroy people than to face any accountability for what he'd built. Burns won. Burns always wins, because in Springfield the man with the money writes the rules, and the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the plant until he dies. Because his grandfather made a deal. Because his mother made a choice. Because the richest man in town needed someone broken enough to sit in Sector 7G and not ask questions. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Number. Section 9. Where is Springfield? The geographic impossibility. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can locate Springfield on a mental map than can name the capital city of half the actual states in the country. It is, in the cultural geography of American life, more real than many places that actually exist, and nobody knows where it is. Not in a vague way. Not in the way that fictional settings are sometimes geographically imprecise. Springfield is unknowable in a way that appears to be deliberate, maintained, and protected. 36 seasons of evidence have been compiled and analyzed. Entire databases of clues have been assembled and cross-referenced, and the result of all that effort is that Springfield could be located in any of approximately 40 American states, depending on which episode you choose as your primary evidence. Let's map the contradictions. Springfield has a coastline. Multiple episodes have shown the town bordering an ocean or a large bay, with harbor infrastructure and beachfront neighborhoods. Springfield also has mountains, not hills. Mountains, with snowcaps and ski resorts, and the kinds of elevation gradients that require hours of driving to traverse in real American geography. Springfield has a desert. The kind of genuine arid desert with cacti and heat shimmers, and the specific quality of light that exists in the American Southwest. Springfield has dense forest. The kind of Pacific Northwest or Appalachian forest that is geographically incompatible with the desert you just drove past. Springfield has farmland. The rolling, cornfield-dense agricultural landscape of the American Midwest, stretching to the horizon in the way that only the genuinely flat interior of the continent allows. No single American location has all of these things within reasonable driving distance of a town center. No real Springfield could have mountains and desert and ocean and forest and farmland all close enough to serve as plausible day-trip destinations. The geography is impossible. And it has been impossible since the beginning, and the show has never once flagged it as a problem worth addressing. The clues the show has provided about the state Springfield is located in are similarly contradictory. Lisa's area code appears in one episode to be a Missouri prefix. The state abbreviation has been shown on various official documents in ways that don't correspond to any real American state. In one episode, when Homer calls the state capital, the operator's response is consistent with a state whose name begins with a vowel, which narrows the possibilities to 8 and still leaves the field very wide. The show has depicted Springfield as bordering Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on the episode in question. Those 4 states do not share borders with each other or with any single other state. Matt Groening, the show's creator, settled this debate definitively in 2012 during an interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He revealed that Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon, his hometown's neighbor, and that he had chosen the name partly because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, appearing in dozens of states, making it easy for viewers anywhere in the country to feel that Springfield might be near them. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery was resolved. Springfield was Oregon adjacent. The answer existed. The puzzle was solved. And then the show kept making episodes that placed Springfield in geographic contexts that were incompatible with Oregon. The writers, by and large, did not honor Groening's confession. They continued constructing Springfield's geography out of contradictions. Because Groening's answer, while truthful about the inspiration, was insufficient as a solution. Where Springfield came from and where Springfield is are different questions, and the show has always been much more interested in the second question than in answering it. Because the impossibility of Springfield's location is not an oversight, it is not a failure of the writers to maintain geographic continuity. It is the show's most sophisticated structural choice, running underneath every episode and never acknowledged, because the joke requires that nobody acknowledge it. Springfield's geographic ambiguity is intentional. It has been maintained deliberately, across hundreds of episodes, as a mechanism for ensuring that the town belongs to every viewer, regardless of where they actually live. Springfield is the town you grew up in, not your literal town, not the specific geographic location with the specific address, but the town in the sense of a community with a school and a bar, and a church and a nuclear plant, and a neighborhood where the houses are all similar and everyone knows everyone. Springfield is everywhere, USA. It has oceanfront property because some American towns have oceanfront property. It has mountains because some American towns have mountains nearby. It has deserts and farmland and forests and gorges because America has all of those things, and Springfield is meant to feel like all of them simultaneously so that no viewer ever feels that the show is set somewhere so specific that it doesn't apply to their experience. This is the surface-level explanation. Groening has confirmed it. The writers have confirmed it. The show is deliberately designed to be geographically universal so that the broadest possible American audience can recognize themselves in it. But under the lens of the theories we've been building through this entire discussion, the geographic impossibility takes on different dimensions. If the radiation theory is true, If Springfield is a contamination zone where the laws of biology have been warped by decades of nuclear exposure, why should the laws of geography be exempt? If the plant can produce mutations in the human population, if it can alter biology in ways that defy normal cellular mechanics, there's no particular reason to assume its effects stop at the edge of town. Maybe Springfield has both mountains and oceans, because the contamination doesn't just affect the people inside the town. Maybe it affects the physical landscape around it. Maybe decades of unregulated nuclear runoff have done something to the geological environment as well as the biological one. Maybe Springfield's geographic impossibility is simply what happens when you irradiate a region for long enough and hard enough that the normal rules stop applying to it. The coma theory offers a more emotionally resonant explanation. Homer's dreaming mind does not have a precise map of America in its memory banks. It has impressions. It has fragments. Pieces of every place Homer ever visited, or drove past, or saw on television, assembled into a landscape that feels coherent within the dream, because dreams construct their geography from emotional logic rather than cartographic accuracy. The mountains Homer remembers from a vacation. The beach Homer remembers from a trip with Marge. The desert Homer saw in a movie. The farmland Homer drove past on a highway years ago. All of those impressions layered on top of each other without regard for geographic consistency, because the unconscious mind that's assembling them doesn't have a geographer's precision. It has a dreamer's logic, and dreamers build their worlds out of feeling rather than fact. The collective denial theory, the one illustrated so clearly by the principal and the pauper, suggests something more pragmatic and more sinister. You can't investigate a town you can't locate on a map. You can't bring federal charges against a nuclear facility if the state it's registered in keeps changing. You can't hold anyone accountable for what's happening in a community whose jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is, in this reading, not a design choice made for the comfort of the audience. It's a legal shield. A community that floats between states has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent EPA oversight, no permanent state attorney general whose office is empowered to investigate 342 safety violations. Springfield doesn't have a fixed location because a fixed location would mean accountability, and accountability would mean someone showing up with a badge and a warrant and starting to ask questions about the three-eyed fish. In the Season 12 mockumentary episode Behind the Laughter, the show addressed Springfield's location with characteristic ambivalence. The episode, formatted as a VH1-style documentary about the Simpson family as a real entertainment phenomenon, stated that the family was from northern Kentucky. This was, for a moment, another apparent resolution, but in syndicated reruns of the same episode, the location was changed to a different state entirely. The answer to where Springfield is literally varies depending on which version of the episode you're watching and on which platform. The show gave you the truth and then changed the truth based on the format. Even when Springfield has a definitive answer, that answer isn't definitive. It mutates. It refuses to stay fixed, like everything else in this town. There's something philosophically interesting about this refusal. The most famous fictional town in American cultural history is the only one that genuinely belongs to everyone, not as a metaphor, but as a literal geographic ambiguity. It exists in every state because it has never committed to being in any particular one. And because it exists everywhere, it can be nobody's responsibility to clean it up or investigate its nuclear plant or look into why the fish have 3 eyes. A town that could be anywhere is a town that no one can shut down. Springfield will never be definitively located, not because the show can't decide, but because the show decided long ago that an unlocatable Springfield is more useful to it than a locatable one. The mystery keeps it universal, the ambiguity keeps it safe, and the impossibility keeps it exactly where it has always been, everywhere in America, and nowhere you can find on a map. Section 10. The Floating Timeline and Why Nobody Ages. We've arrived at the center of it all. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted on the 17th of December, 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then and is 8 now. Maggie was 1 and is 1. Homer and Marge were somewhere in their mid-30s when the show began, and they remain exactly there, while the real-world population that watches them has grown progressively older around them. 36 years have passed in the world we all live in. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The characters exist in what the television industry calls a floating timeline. The show's present is always the viewer's present, When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When it aired in 1995, they were living in 1995. The cultural references update, the technology in the backgrounds updates, the news events referenced in the stories update. But the characters themselves don't move. They stay frozen at the ages they were when the show began, while everything around them flows forward and they remain still. The industry rationale for this is practical. Episodic animated shows aren't designed to be consumed as a continuous narrative with ongoing character development. They're designed to be accessible at any point. A viewer who tunes in for the first time in season 28 doesn't need to know what happened in seasons 1 through 27 to understand what's happening. The characters are always the same age, always in the same relationships, always facing the same fundamental dynamics. It's a feature, not a bug, of the format. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has started to generate contradictions of a scale that make it impossible to ignore if you're paying attention. The clearest of these is the problem of Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their shared history was grounded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during an era defined by specific music and fashion and cultural touchstones. Their courtship was set against a backdrop of post-Vietnam America. The details were period-appropriate for parents who would have been in their mid-30s in 1989. It made sense. As the floating timeline dragged the show's present forward through the 1990s and into the 2000s and beyond, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they didn't meet in 1980. They met around 2005. Their high school experience wasn't defined by disco and Watergate. It was defined by MySpace and early YouTube. The show has addressed this with complete candor by simply redrawing their past. Homer and Marge have been hippies and then grunge fans and then hipsters and then millennials, depending on when a flashback episode aired and what cultural period was contemporary enough to be accessible to the current audience. Their origin story has been told and retold at least 4 times, each version placing their formative years in a different decade. Their memories are unstable. Their history is not a fixed thing that happened in a specific past and remains consistent across all references to it. Their history is a draft, and it gets revised every few years, and nobody in the show notices, because the show's world doesn't notice things that would require it to acknowledge how time actually works. This is, when you look at it directly, extremely strange. These are 2 people who cannot agree on when they grew up, because the show cannot agree on when they grew up, because their past is adjusted to fit whatever the present requires. They are people without a fixed history, people whose memories reshape themselves to serve the current narrative, people whose past is, in a meaningful sense, not real. Now apply the theories to this because every single one of them leads to the same conclusion. The coma theory says nobody ages because they live inside the frozen mind of a man who lost consciousness in April 1993 and has not regained it. Homer's dreaming brain cannot imagine his children growing older. It has no template for Bart at 20, or Lisa at 18, or what Marge looks like in her 50s. It has only what it had at the moment the vending machine fell, his family as they were, preserved at the last moment he actually saw them. And so that's how they remain. Not because time has stopped, because Homer's access to new information about them has stopped. And the dream can only work with what Homer had at the time he went under. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the contamination has done something to the biological mechanisms that drive normal cellular aging. The mutations produced by decades of nuclear exposure don't just alter physical appearance and cognitive function. They alter the fundamental cellular processes that cause time to accumulate in a body. The people of Springfield are not aging because their cells have been reprogrammed by whatever is in the water and the air and the ecosystem downstream from those cracked cooling towers to not age. Burns is not the only person in Springfield whose relationship with biological time has been disrupted. He is just the most extreme, the most documented case. Everyone in Springfield is living in a state of metabolic suspension. The clock's running but not advancing, because the contamination has broken the mechanism that connects the passage of time to the accumulation of its effects in a living body. The collective denial theory says nobody ages because Springfield has agreed that nobody ages. The same social contract that allowed the town to vote the real Seymour Skinner out of existence and replace him with a legal fiction extends to the passage of time itself. If the community agrees to treat the present as permanent, if the unspoken contract says we will not acknowledge the passage of years, If anyone who insists on noting that time has passed is treated as a disruptive force and marginalized accordingly, then the floating timeline is not a production convention. It's a social choice, a community-wide decision to treat the permanence of things as non-negotiable. The Burns immortality theory adds a supporting element to this. If at least one person in Springfield has demonstrably found a way to cheat biological time through the application of technology and wealth, if the oldest man in town is empirically proof that the normal relationship between time and the human body can be disrupted by sufficient intervention, then the concept of aging is already negotiable in this universe. Burns's existence proves it, which makes the town's refusal to age feel less like an anomaly and more like a natural consequence of living in a world where aging is known to be a problem with an engineering solution rather than an inevitable biological fact. The prediction theory says something more unsettling, that the Simpsons exist in a feedback loop with American culture so tight and so long-running that the distinction between what the show predicts and what actually happens has become difficult to maintain. And within that feedback loop, the character's eternal youth is part of what's being reflected back. America doesn't want its icons to age. America holds on to its cultural touchstones with a ferocity that has nothing to do with any individual show's merit and everything to do with what those touchstones represent. The Simpsons aren't frozen because of a production convention. They're frozen because we will them to be frozen. Because we tune in every season and confirm, by our continued watching, that we still want them exactly as they are. The show has imagined the characters aging. It's done it more than once. The season 6 episode, Lisa's Wedding, is the most famous example. The show flashes forward to a future in which Lisa is a young woman about to be married. She's 23. She has become, in the fullness of time and in the fullness of her particular intelligence and idealism, something like the person the show has always quietly suggested she'd become. The episode is detailed and emotionally specific and completely convincing. It proves that the writers know exactly who these characters would be as adults. It proves that the imagination necessary to tell those stories exists, fully developed, in the room where the show is made. And then, Lisa returns to being 8 years old. The future closes. The permanent present resumes. And the glimpse disappears, leaving only the knowledge that it existed. The show can imagine growth. It chooses not to allow it. And that choice is the most revealing thing about what The Simpsons is really doing. Because the floating timeline, when you pull back far enough to see its outline, is not a story about these characters. It's a statement about us. The Simpsons are the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as embodied by The Simpsons, cannot be allowed to change. Homer must always be middle-aged and employed at the plant and capable of stumbling home at 5:30 and strangling his son and being forgiven by his wife and going to sleep and doing it all again tomorrow. Marge must always be patient. Bart must always be rebellious. Lisa must always be the one asking questions nobody wants to answer. Maggie must always be silent, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting. The moment Bart grows up, the show is over. Not just because a character has aged, but because the particular thing the show represents, that specific configuration of American family life, would be finished. The kids would leave. The house would be different. Homer and Marge would be older. And the show would be required at that point to tell a different kind of story. A story about what comes after. About what a family looks like when the children are gone, and the parents are facing their lives without the structure that children provide. About what you do when the loop you've been living in finally reaches its end. That story is an elegy. America doesn't watch The Simpsons for an elegy. America watches it because it wants the house to look the same. Because it wants the couch gag and the opening titles and Homer stumbling home and Marge saying and Bart saying don't have a cow. Man and Lisa playing her saxophone and Maggie's pacifier squeaking in the quiet moments. Because that configuration, that specific arrangement of people in a house on a fictional street in an impossible town, is something we built together over 36 years, and we are not ready to let it dissolve. The floating timeline is ours. We built it, not the writers, not the animators. We built it through 36 years of watching, through the cultural act of returning every season, through the collective agreement that these characters would remain as we first knew them for as long as we kept watching. We pressed pause in 1989, and we never pressed play. And now here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family in the same house on the same street in the same impossible town. Every theory in this entire discussion leads here. The radiation, the coma, the collective denial, the immortal billionaire, the predictions, and the patterns, all of it arrives at the same place, eventually. Time stopped in Springfield because we stopped it. Because the alternative, allowing time to pass, allowing the loop to break, allowing the story to move toward the conclusion that all stories eventually reach, requires admitting something we're not ready to admit. That 36 years have passed, that we're older now, that the world has changed in ways we didn't choose and can't reverse. That the couch we sat on as children watching Homer fall off something for the 100th time is gone, or in another house, or in a landfill somewhere. That the specific combination of circumstances that made us love this show, the particular moment in our lives when we first discovered it, cannot be recovered. That everything we try to hold on to eventually slips through. As long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, we don't have to admit any of that. We can sit down and turn on the television and go home to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's been the point since the 17th of December 1989. Not the radiation theory or the coma theory or the who shot Burns mystery. Not the immortal billionaire or the silent genius or the geographic impossibility. Those are all real, and they're all worth following wherever they lead. But underneath all of them, running through every episode and every theory and every 36 years of Sunday nights, there is something simpler. We love them. This impossible, yellow-skinned, four-fingered family in their cracked, contaminated, unmappable town. We love Homer with his donuts and his stubbornness and his enormous, uncomplicated heart. We love Marge with her patient, steel cable endurance and the blue tower of her hair. We love Bart with his skateboard and his capacity for both chaos and loyalty. We love Lisa for fighting, always fighting, even when nothing she does changes anything. We love Maggie for watching all of it and saying nothing, her enormous eyes taking in the whole mess of the family around her. We love them, and so we keep them young. We keep them safe inside the loop. We keep Springfield running, the plant leaking, the cooling towers cracking, the river running its three-eyed fish downstream. We keep it all exactly as it was on the night we first tuned in, because the alternative is too quiet and too final and too much like growing up. That's the biggest mystery of The Simpsons. Not where Burns got his immortality treatments or who really pulled the trigger on that sundial night in 1995. The biggest mystery is why we can't let go. And I think we both know the answer to that. Because they're us. Homer is our father, or the version of our father we needed him to be. Marge is the person holding it all together, the way someone always has to hold it all together in every family that has ever existed. Bart is the part of us that refuses to comply. Lisa is the part of us that keeps asking questions even when the answers are discouraging. And Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden. The one that sees everything, understands everything, says nothing, and waits. We can't let them go because letting them go means something. It means time. It means the years that have passed while we were watching. It means the slow accumulation of a life lived outside a cartoon, where consequences stick and people age and houses change and nothing resets by next Sunday. Springfield will always be there. The loop will keep running. Homer will keep working at the plant. Burns will keep doing whatever the treatments require. Maggie will keep watching everything behind her pacifier. And Lisa will keep playing her saxophone in her room, alone, asking questions nobody wants to answer. And we'll keep watching. Because some places you can always go back to. Some families stay exactly as you left them, no matter how long you've been away. Some towns refuse to change, no matter how much time the world outside insists has passed. Springfield doesn't age, neither do the reasons we love it. And honestly, neither do we when we're there. Number. Section 11. The Dark Mirror of Ned Flanders. There is a character in The Simpsons who has been quietly enduring one of the most sustained exercises in narrative cruelty in the history of American television. And the show presents this cruelty as comedy, and most of the audience accepts it as comedy. And the whole arrangement works because the person being destroyed is too good to complain about it. Ned Flanders lives next door to Homer Simpson. He has lived next door to Homer for the entire run of the show. He is, by any objective measure applied to the universe of Springfield, a substantially better person than Homer in almost every conceivable respect. He is kind, he is generous, He is devoutly religious in a way that appears to be genuine rather than performative. He is physically fit, financially responsible, a present and involved father, an attentive neighbor. He bakes, he helps, he shows up. When something goes wrong in the neighborhood, Ned is the person who appears at the door with food and a willingness to assist, and the show punishes him for it. Relentlessly, systematically, and over a period of 36 years. The most significant punishment was the death of his wife. Maud Flanders died in a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway. A t-shirt cannon, deployed to fire promotional merchandise into the crowd during a racing event, misfired. Homer was the reason it misfired, specifically because Homer was dodging the incoming shirts, and the trajectory correction that followed sent them into Maud instead. She was struck and fell from the bleachers. She died. And Ned, being Ned, forgave Homer. He forgave the man who, through his characteristic combination of selfishness and obliviousness, had caused his wife's death. He forgave him because that's what Ned does. He absorbs punishment, and he forgives, and he moves forward because he has built his entire life on the principle that grace is the appropriate response to harm. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house, and the community rebuilds it so inadequately that it collapses immediately, Ned snaps. He has what the show depicts as a complete psychological breakdown. He yells at every person in Springfield who has ever wronged him. He says things he has been holding inside for decades. He is honest, finally and catastrophically, about what it has actually cost him to be Ned Flanders in a world that does not reward Ned Flanders. And then he is institutionalized. He is committed to a mental health facility where a therapist works with him, and the therapy reveals something that recontextualizes every scene of Ned's patience and grace and relentless positivity that has come before it. Ned was not always this way. As a child, he was violent and uncontrollable. His parents, being the kind of people who belonged to the counterculture of their era and who had specific philosophical objections to conventional discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive behavioral therapy. He was subjected to a prolonged behavioral modification program that essentially rewired his emotional responses. The anger that was there, the rage that a difficult child carries, was suppressed, not resolved. Suppressed. Built over. Walled away behind a behavioral architecture that presents as saintly patience, but is actually a psychological structure built to contain something. Ned's kindness is not a character trait, it's a cage. He cannot express anger because his brain was literally conditioned to suppress it during childhood. His patience is not a virtue he chose and developed through spiritual practice. It is a compulsion, a programmed response that fires automatically because the alternative, allowing the underlying affect to surface, was treated as unacceptable when he was a child, and trained out of him before he was old enough to make a different decision. His faith is the cope that makes the rest of it bearable. He needs a framework that explains why he keeps suffering despite doing everything right. He needs to believe that there is a plan, that the suffering has a purpose, that the grace he extends to people who harm him will eventually be returned in some form. Without that framework, without the theological scaffolding of his religion, what remains is a man who was conditioned as a child to be incapable of protecting himself, who has spent his entire adult life absorbing harm from the people around him, and who has received nothing in return that resembles the reciprocity a person doing what he does would be entitled to expect. His forgiveness of Homer after Maud's death is not grace. It is the programmed response of a man who was conditioned to never under any circumstances allow his anger to surface, no matter what precipitates it. Homer's selfishness killed Ned's wife, and the programming that was installed in Ned during childhood ensured that his response would look like forgiveness rather than the rage that any non-conditioned person would feel and be entitled to feel. The show knows this. It showed you the revelation, and it showed you its implications, and then it mostly moved on. The way the show moves on from most of its darker implications, because the show needs Ned to keep functioning in his role as the foil for Homer's chaos. But the information is there, and once you have it, every scene of Ned's gentleness looks different, not saintly, trapped. And then there's the God problem. The show has established, across multiple episodes, that God exists within the universe of The Simpsons. This is not a metaphorical or ambiguous presence. God appears, speaks, and interacts with characters. God is real within the show's logic. And Homer Simpson, a man who sleeps through church when he bothers to attend, who has an at-best casual and frequently adversarial relationship with organized religion, has had direct personal conversations with God on at least 2 separate occasions. God talks to Homer. God has talked to Homer about specific personal matters. God has given Homer guidance, predictions, warnings. God has never, in any documented episode of the show's 36-year run, spoken to Ned Flanders. Ned attends church every Sunday. Ned prays with genuine conviction. Ned has organized his entire life around his faith. Ned has extended grace and forgiveness to the people around him specifically because his faith tells him that this is the right way to live. Ned has done everything that his tradition tells him will bring him into right relationship with the divine. God talks to Homer. God ignores Ned. The drunk who falls asleep in the pew gets a direct personal conversation with the Almighty. The devout man who has structured every day of his adult life around his relationship with God gets silence. This is not accidental. The show is telling you something specific with this arrangement. The universe of The Simpsons is not one in which moral behavior is rewarded. It is not one in which the righteous receive the attention and the grace that their righteousness might be thought to merit. It is a universe in which the system, whether that system is Burns's economic control, or the ambient radiation, or the collective social denial, or the floating timeline, or just the specific indifferent structure of how things work in Springfield, does not care about moral behavior. It cares about something else. Compliance, maybe. Or entropy. Or the kind of chaos that Homer embodies and that the universe seems to find more interesting than Ned's carefully ordered virtue. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that doesn't reward rightness. He is the show's most honest statement about the relationship between virtue and outcome in Springfield. You can be Ned Flanders. You can be kind and generous and faithful and forgiving and present and good, and you will lose your wife to a t-shirt cannon and have your house destroyed, and be told by the universe, repeatedly and clearly, that none of what you've built in service of being a good person is going to protect you from the same chaos that finds everyone else. Homer is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that doesn't consistently punish wrongness. He is selfish and oblivious and sometimes actively harmful to the people around him. He causes damage that he rarely fully accounts for. He survives everything and resets and comes home to a family that, inexplicably and movingly, always takes him back. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. And the gap between them, the gap between the man who tries and the man who doesn't, between the man who earns everything and the man who receives everything, regardless of earning, has never once closed. Because Springfield doesn't close that gap. Springfield doesn't have the architecture for it. The system was never designed to deliver outcomes proportional to the moral quality of the people inside it. It was designed to keep Homer at the plant, and Ned at the church, and Burns at the top, and everyone exactly where they are in the arrangement that serves Burns's interests. The righteous neighbor is just as useful to that arrangement as the damaged safety inspector, because both of them stay in their places, and neither of them challenges anything. Ned Flanders is the saddest character in The Simpsons. Not Homer, who is too cognitively compromised to fully comprehend the shape of his own suffering. Not Lisa, who is young enough to still believe that the fight is worth fighting. Not Burns, who is too insulated by wealth to ever have to genuinely reckon with what he's done. Ned Flanders, the man who built his entire life on the belief that goodness is rewarded, and who receives, in return for that belief and that effort, a dead wife and a destroyed house and a neighbor who will never appreciate him, and a God who talks to everyone but him. That's the thesis statement of The Simpsons, buried in plain sight in the relationship between two men on either side of a white picket fence. The universe isn't fair. The system doesn't care about your virtue, and the most carefully constructed life, built brick by brick on the principles you were taught to believe would sustain it, is just as vulnerable to chaos as the most carelessly lived one. The only difference is that Ned feels it more because he thought he had a deal. Section 12. Hans Moleman and the body count nobody notices. His name is Hans Moleman. He is a small, nearly blind man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists across 36 seasons of the show, primarily to suffer and die. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by objects of various sizes. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals. He falls into things and gets struck by things and walks into traffic in ways that disappear under wheels. He has been incinerated. He has been attacked. He has been killed in ways that the show's writers, clearly enjoying the creative challenge, have expanded and varied with the same kind of inventive commitment that other shows put into their main characters' development arcs. By any serious accounting, Hans Moleman has died more times in more creatively varied ways than any other character in the history of American animation. Not in dream sequences. Not in fantasy sequences or Treehouse of Horror episodes that are explicitly designated as non-canonical. In regular episodes of The Simpsons, in the primary narrative universe of the show, Hans Moleman dies repeatedly and then reappears in the next episode completely unaffected, ready to be killed again in a new and interesting way. The show treats this as background noise, a running gag, an established comedic rhythm that regular viewers recognize and new viewers find confusing until they've seen enough of it to understand that Hans Moleman's deaths are not plot developments, they're a texture. A feature of Springfield's environment, the same way the cracked cooling towers are a feature. You stop questioning them after a while, but under the frameworks we've been developing through this entire discussion, Hans Moleman's deaths are deeply strange and worth examining carefully. Start with the radiation theory. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces biological mutations, and if those mutations affect different individuals differently depending on their specific response to the environmental inputs, then Moleman might represent the most extreme case of a particular kind of mutation. Not the cognitive effects that have altered Homer's intelligence, or the metabolic effects that keep Burns alive, or the amplified cognition that seems to characterize Maggie. Something different. Something that affects the relationship between Moleman's biology and death itself. He doesn't survive his deaths the way Homer survives injuries. Homer endures damage and heals from it. His body absorbs trauma and recovers through some combination of cartoon physics and whatever the radiation has done to his cellular resilience. But Moleman's situation is different. He actually dies. His body ceases to function, in ways that are sometimes depicted with remarkable specificity, and then he comes back. Completely. Without reference to what happened, as if death, for Moleman specifically, is not a permanent state but a temporary interruption that his biology can recover from the same way a normal body recovers from a cold. If the radiation in Springfield's water and air has done this to Moleman's biology, if it has somehow disrupted the cellular mechanisms that make death permanent, then Moleman is the most extreme example of what the contamination can produce. Not additional eyes or 4 fingers or yellow skin. A complete decoupling of the biological concept of death from the finality that the concept normally implies. Death for Hans Moleman is inconvenient. It is not permanent. And the radiation theory is the only available explanation within the show's own logic for how this might be possible. The coma theory offers a different interpretation, and one that is perhaps more disturbing in its implications. If Springfield is Homer's dream, if every episode is the product of an unconscious mind maintaining a simulation of a familiar world, then Hans Moleman is a minor character in that simulation. He is not someone Homer knew well or cared about deeply. He is a peripheral figure, someone who populates the background of Springfield, the way extras populate the background of a film set. And Homer's dreaming mind, generating the simulation from available memory and ambient stimulus, does not maintain minor peripheral characters with the same consistency that it maintains the people who matter to him. Moleman dies because Homer's dreaming brain occasionally lets background processes lapse. He comes back because the dream needs him to populate scenes. He is not a person, in this reading. He is a recurring element of the simulation's background fidelity, one that the simulation's generating engine treats as disposable and recreates as needed. Each death is the simulation dropping a background process. Each return is the simulation rebuilding it because the next scene needs it. Moleman is furniture. And furniture breaks and gets replaced without anyone noting the replacement because nobody is keeping track of the furniture. The collective denial theory says Moleman's deaths are simply another thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies publicly, repeatedly, in front of witnesses, in a town where public events are generally observed by crowds, and nobody investigates. Nobody asks questions. Nobody follows up on the missing person who was very visibly killed in the town square last week and who has now reappeared as though nothing happened. Springfield has normalized Moleman's deaths, the way it has normalized everything else that should be alarming. The three-eyed fish, the glowing billionaire, the principal who isn't who he says he is, the baby who shot a man, and the tiny elderly man who dies every few weeks and shows up for more. The most telling detail about Hans Moleman is something the show mentions once and never returns to: his age. Moleman has stated his age as 31 years old. 31. Look at him. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s. He moves like a very old man. He has the physical characteristics of someone in the final decades of a long life. He requires thick corrective lenses to function. He moves with the careful, deliberate locomotion of someone whose body no longer performs reliably. If Moleman is telling the truth about his age, and there is no compelling narrative reason within the episode in which he states it to assume he is lying, then something has aged him decades beyond his biological age. Something took a man in his early 30s and turned him into what he looks like. Something so extreme in its effects that 31 years of actual biological time produced the visible appearance of 80 or 90. And the same something, whatever it did to accelerate his aging to this degree, also appears to have done something unusual to his relationship with mortality. He looks ancient and he dies constantly, and he keeps coming back. The radiation theory has an answer for this. Accelerated aging and disrupted mortality, both produced by the same environmental contamination, expressing differently in Moleman's specific biology than they express in Homer's or Burns's or Maggie's. The coma theory has an answer for this. A background character in a dream doesn't need to be internally consistent. He can be old and young simultaneously, dead and alive in alternating episodes, because the dream doesn't maintain that level of detail for peripheral figures. The collective denial theory has an answer. The town has agreed not to notice any of this. The only thing that doesn't have an answer is the explanation that says The Simpsons is just a cartoon and none of it means anything. Because the specificity of Moleman's situation, the stated age of 31, the repeated deaths, the repeated returns, is too specific to be entirely meaningless even within the logic of a cartoon. There is something happening with Hans Moleman. The show knows it. The writers put the details in deliberately, and Springfield looks right past him, every time, the way Springfield looks past everything that would be uncomfortable to look at directly. Number. Section 13. What the Treehouse of Horror tells us. Every year, typically around Halloween, The Simpsons airs a special anthology episode, 3 short stories loosely connected by a framing device, set outside the normal continuity of the show. Characters die. Reality breaks in ways it doesn't break in regular episodes. The impossible becomes more impossible. Horror conventions get parodied and subverted. The show gives itself permission to do things it can't do in its regular format, because the Treehouse of Horror episodes are explicitly labeled as non-canonical. Except the things the Treehouse of Horror episodes do have a way of bleeding into the show's primary continuity in interesting ways. Ideas first introduced in these anthology specials have appeared in modified forms in regular episodes. Tones and dynamics explored in the Halloween context have informed how the show handles certain characters outside of it. The division between the canonical and the non-canonical is less firm than the show's official position on it suggests. But that's not the most interesting thing about the Treehouse of Horror episodes. The most interesting thing is what they reveal about the show's awareness of its own mythology. The Treehouse episodes frequently engage, obliquely or directly, with the fan theories that have grown up around the show. They depict Springfield being destroyed in ways that parody the show's actual history of being destroyed and resetting. They put characters in situations that exaggerate the dynamics that fan theorists have identified in regular continuity. They play with the mechanics of the show's reality, bending them further than usual and then snapping them back, in ways that suggest the writers are fully aware of what careful viewers have noticed about how the show's world works. The Homer as a 3-dimensional figure episode is the most explicit example. In it, Homer is pulled into a 3-dimensional digital space and interacts with it in ways that require him to navigate an environment operating on different physical laws than the 2-dimensional world he normally inhabits. The episode is formally playful and technically impressive for its era. But it's also a story about Homer existing in a layer of reality that he doesn't fully understand, surrounded by rules he can't completely see, trying to navigate a world that wasn't built for him. Under the coma theory, that description applies to Homer in every single episode. He is always navigating a reality he doesn't fully understand, built around rules generated by his own unconscious mind, in a world that responds to his presence in ways a real world wouldn't. The 3-dimensional episode just makes the meta quality of Homer's situation explicit in a way that the show can get away with in the Treehouse context, because the context labels it as play. The Treehouse episodes also reveal, through their willingness to kill characters and destroy settings and generally do things that regular episodes can't do, how much of the show's normal restraint is a deliberate choice rather than a limitation. The writers know they could go darker. They know they could go further. The Treehouse episodes demonstrate this annually. The regular episodes don't go further, not because the writers can't imagine it, but because Springfield, as a continuing narrative, requires a certain amount of preservation. The cruelty has to stay within ranges that allow the show to return next week to something recognizable, which is itself an expression of the collective denial theory. Springfield, even within its own creative process, operates by agreed-upon limitations on how much truth can be shown at once. The Treehouse episodes are the exception that proves this rule. They're the vote to acknowledge reality that Springfield never holds. They're the space where the show gets to admit what it knows about itself, without having to carry the weight of that admission into the regular narrative. And every year, they end. The framing device closes, the credits roll, and regular Springfield resumes, the same as it ever was, as if nothing happened, as if the things depicted in those 3 short stories were just a dream. Which, under the coma theory, everything in Springfield already is. Number, Section 14, the economy of Springfield and what it actually runs on. Let's talk about money, because money is the mechanism through which everything in this town actually operates. And the money in Springfield is more interesting than it appears on the surface. The Springfield economy runs on the nuclear power plant. This is the foundational economic fact of the town. The plant is the primary employer in a community where alternative employment opportunities are present but secondary. It provides power to every home and business. Its operation generates economic activity that ripples through every other institution in the town. Moe's Tavern exists, partly because plant workers drink there. The school exists partly because plant workers pay the taxes that fund it. The local government functions, insofar as it functions, on a tax base that the plant's operation substantially supports. Burns controls the plant. Burns, therefore, controls the economy. Not in the abstract political theory sense in which wealthy people are said to control economies through their aggregate financial decisions. Burns controls Springfield's economy in the direct, practical sense. He can make decisions about the plant that immediately and specifically affect every other economic actor in the town. When Burns cuts the school's oil, the school suffers immediately and directly. When Burns shuts down a competitor's business, that business closes. When Burns adjusts how the plant operates, the consequences flow through Springfield's economic ecosystem with the directness of water flowing downhill. This is why Burns's ability to be challenged is so limited. Not because people in Springfield don't recognize that he's harmful. The evidence that Burns is harmful is extensive and publicly documented within the show's universe. It's because the cost of challenging him is potentially the economic collapse of the entire community. The mechanism that sustains everyday life in Springfield is the same mechanism that Burns controls. Threatening Burns means threatening the mechanism. And Springfield, in its accumulated collective wisdom about what it can and cannot afford to do, has concluded that the mechanism cannot be threatened. The residents of Springfield are economically hostage to the man who is poisoning them. This is not an unusual situation in American history or in the history of company towns generally. The pattern is well documented. A single large employer in a community creates a situation where the employer's interests and the community's interests become entangled in ways that make resistance to the employer genuinely costly for everyone who depends on the economic activity the employer generates. Springfield is an extreme and satirical version of a pattern that has appeared many times in real American communities, and Burns has been aware of this dynamic from the beginning. His position at the center of Springfield's economy is not accidental. It was engineered, maintained, and protected through the same kind of deliberate strategic decision-making that characterizes everything Burns does. The nuclear plant is not just a business. It is a mechanism of control. And Burns has spent over a century ensuring that the mechanism remains operative and that no alternative economic structures develop in Springfield that might reduce the community's dependence on it. The deal with Grandpa Simpson is the most explicit example of Burns using the economic relationship to manage potential threats. Grandpa discovered something. Burns offered something in return for silence. The currency of the exchange was Homer's job security. Grandpa accepted, presumably because in a town where Burns controls the primary employer, the ability to guarantee employment is a meaningful form of power. And Burns was able to make that guarantee because he controls the plant and therefore controls who works there and under what conditions. Every other resident of Springfield is in a version of the same position Grandpa was in. They all depend, to varying degrees, on the continued operation of a facility that is harming them. And the man who runs that facility knows this. He has always known this. He built it that way. The show's most honest statement about this dynamic comes from the dome sequence in the movie. The EPA's decision to dome Springfield is presented as a response to environmental contamination. But it's also read another way, a statement about what happens when a company town reaches the logical endpoint of the arrangements that have been sustaining it. The contamination became so severe that the outside world could no longer ignore it. The dome comes down. The people inside it, all the people who depended on the plant and therefore on Burns and therefore on the arrangements that made challenging Burns impossible, are sealed inside with the thing that has been slowly destroying them. That's not a comedy premise. That's a diagnosis of a pattern that has played out in real American communities with different mechanisms but similar dynamics. The economy and the contamination are the same thing. The dependence and the damage are two expressions of the same relationship, and by the time the dome comes down, it's too late to separate them. The town is inside the loop. The loop is sealed. Section 15. The complete picture. We've walked through 9 theories and explored a dozen subsidiary questions. We've followed the radiation from the cracked towers, through the water supply, and into the biology of every Springfield resident. We've traced Homer's unconscious mind through 32 years of increasingly surreal dream content. We've reopened the shooting investigation and examined the evidence against the official answer. We've looked at Burns's medical treatments and his 100-plus years of engineered survival. We've watched Springfield vote to expel truth from its community and make convenient lies legally binding. We've examined Maggie's silence as a strategic choice made by an extraordinary mind. We've considered the predictions through the lens of statistical volume and cultural influence. We've followed Mona Simpson's trail from a suburban Springfield kitchen to a federal fugitive's decades underground and traced the wreckage through 3 generations of her family. We've searched for Springfield on every map and found it nowhere specific and everywhere general. And we've stared at the floating timeline until the mechanism behind it became visible. What do all of these things add up to? Every one of these theories is different. They use different evidence, different logic, different assumptions about what the show is and what it's trying to do. The radiation theory is materialist and political. The coma theory is psychological and emotional. The collective denial theory is sociological. The Burns immortality theory is economic. The prediction theory is cultural. The Mona Simpson theory is personal and familial. But every single one of them arrives at the same conclusion, reached by different paths. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental. Something that goes deeper than animated storytelling conventions or episodic production formats, or the practical necessities of a show that has been running for 36 years. Something has broken the normal rules of the world in this town. The biology doesn't work right, the memory doesn't work right, the time doesn't work right, the accountability doesn't work right. The relationships between cause and consequence have been disrupted in ways that affect every character and every story. And the show has been telling you this from the beginning. Not through exposition, not through dramatic reveals or narrative moments specifically designed to carry the weight of the revelation. Through accumulation. Through the slow, patient layering of detail on detail on detail, spread across hundreds of episodes and 36 years of Sunday nights, until the picture becomes impossible to ignore. The Simpsons isn't hiding its mysteries. It's showing them to you, every week. In the cracked cooling towers and the 3-eyed fish and the yellow skin and the 4 fingers, and the man who glows in the dark, and the baby who shot a billionaire, and the principal who isn't who he says he is, and the mother who vanished, and the coma that might still be ongoing, and the predictions that keep coming true. The show shows you all of this. And then it trusts you to either see it or not, because Springfield's survival depends on enough people choosing not to. Springfield's collective amnesia, its agreed-upon denial, its willingness to vote truth out of the community whenever truth becomes inconvenient, requires an audience that participates in the amnesia. We are Springfield's denial mechanism. We watch the show, and we laugh at the jokes, and we accept the yellow skin, and the impossible geography, and the man who never ages, and we go to sleep and we don't ask the questions. Some people ask the questions. They always have been. The fan theorists, the people who watch closely enough and think carefully enough and connect enough of the dots to see what the accumulated evidence points toward, they're the real Seymour Skinners of the Simpsons fandom. They show up with the truth and get told by the official version that the official version is the only version that counts. But the truth stays. It always stays. You can vote it out of the community. You can tie it to a train. You can make it illegal to speak its name. And it's still there, in the cracked towers, in the water, in the bodies of people who have been drinking that water their whole lives. The truth about Springfield doesn't go away, because Springfield agreed to stop acknowledging it. It just gets quieter. It waits. And here you are, late at night, somewhere in the world, having spent this time following the truth through its winding path through 36 seasons of one of the most analyzed pieces of American popular culture in history. You followed it through the radiation, and the coma, and the shooting mystery, and the immortal billionaire, and the vote, and the genius baby, and the predictions, and the mother's exile, and the geographic impossibility, and the frozen time. You know what Springfield is now. Or at least you know one version of it, the version that lives underneath the jokes. The show will never confirm it. The writers will keep making episodes in which Homer stumbles through the door at 5:30 and Marge manages the household with her particular brand of patient, steel cable competence. And Bart does something that should have consequences but doesn't, and Lisa asks questions that nobody answers. And Maggie watches everything from behind her pacifier, waiting. The loop will keep running, the towers will keep cracking, the water will keep flowing, and somewhere in a hospital in Springfield, maybe, a man is lying in a bed with machines running around him, dreaming about his family, his children exactly as he last saw them, his wife exactly as she was, his house on Evergreen Terrace exactly as it has always been, dreaming that everything is fine, dreaming that nothing has changed, dreaming that the story never has to end. And in the dream, it doesn't. In the dream, it goes on forever, Sunday night after Sunday night. The same family, on the same couch, in the same house, in the same impossible town, while the world outside keeps turning and the years keep passing, and the man in the hospital bed keeps holding on to the only thing he has left. His family. His dream of his family. Exactly as they were, exactly as they are. Forever. Number. Section 16. The complete Springfield bestiary. Every character through the radiation lens. We've spent a great deal of time with the Simpson family and with Burns, and for good reason. They're the center of everything. But Springfield is not just the Simpsons and their antagonist. Springfield is a community of dozens of recurring characters, all of whom have been living in the same environment, drinking the same water, breathing the same air, and being shaped by the same forces that have shaped the family at the show's center. And when you look at those characters through the lens of the radiation theory, some very interesting patterns emerge. Let's start with Chief Wiggum. Clancy Wiggum is the chief of police in Springfield. He is, by any reasonable professional standard, catastrophically unsuited to that role. He is slow, both physically and cognitively. He misses obvious conclusions. He fails to follow basic investigative procedures. He makes mistakes so elementary that they would result in dismissal from most police forces within weeks of their first occurrence. And yet he has been the chief of police for the entire run of the show, apparently without serious challenge to his tenure. The radiation theory has an explanation for Wiggum that connects to a detail from the Mona Simpson storyline that's easy to miss. When Mona and her activist group broke into Burns's biological weapons laboratory in 1969, one of the incidental effects of their antibiotic bomb was the accidental curing of the facility's security guard's asthma. That security guard was Clancy Wiggum. The young, asthma-ridden security guard who was working Burns's germ warfare facility in 1969 grew up to become Springfield's chief of police. Wiggum has spent his career in a position he is manifestly unqualified to hold. He has been ineffective at every significant investigation the show has documented. He has failed to solve crimes, failed to prevent crimes he was positioned to prevent, and failed to notice things that were visible and obvious to casual observers. Under the radiation theory, Wiggum's cognitive impairment is not personal limitation. It is environmental, the same contamination that affects everyone in Springfield, expressing in the specific form that Wiggum's particular biology produces. But the connection to the germ warfare facility adds a dimension. Wiggum was present at Burns's biological weapons laboratory in his youth. He was in close proximity to whatever that facility was producing. Whatever the antibiotic bomb did to the biological agent stored there, the effects of that proximity on Wiggum's own biology remain unexplored. The show never follows this up, but the connection is there. The man who grew up to be Springfield's inadequate chief of police spent time in Burns's biological weapons lab during its operation, in close proximity to experimental pathogens. And he has been mediocre and incapable ever since. Now look at Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon, who runs the quick e-mart that Homer visits constantly throughout the show. Apu is, by the show's own accounting, a highly educated man. He holds a doctorate from a prestigious institution. He chose to remain in Springfield running a convenience store despite this qualification, a choice that has puzzled viewers since the character's introduction. The standard reading is that Apu simply prefers his life in Springfield, complicated as it is, to returning to India. But under the radiation theory, there's a supplementary explanation. Springfield's contaminated environment affects cognitive function in ways that make it difficult for residents to accurately assess their own situation and make decisions that would benefit them. Apu has been in Springfield long enough that his own decision-making capacity may have been affected by the same ambient contamination that affects everyone else. He knows abstractly that he is overqualified for his current position. But the environmental factors that prevent Springfield residents from acting on uncomfortable truths apply to personal truths as readily as to civic ones. Dr. Hibbert deserves attention because he is Springfield's primary physician and the person whose professional responsibility is to notice when something medically unusual is affecting the town's population. Dr. Hibbert has been treating Springfield residents for the entire run of the show. He has access to the medical records of every regular character. He has presumably conducted physical examinations of dozens of Springfield residents and has had the opportunity to observe, in clinical settings, the physical characteristics that the radiation theory identifies as markers of environmental contamination. And Dr. Hibbert never notices anything. He treats individual conditions. He diagnoses individual ailments. He laughs at things that should probably concern him professionally. He has never, in 36 seasons, raised a concern about the population-level health effects of living in proximity to a nuclear plant with 342 safety violations. Either Dr. Hibbert is simply not thinking about this at the population level, which would be a significant professional failure by someone with his level of training, or Dr. Hibbert's own cognitive function has been compromised by the same environment he's treating everyone else for living in, or Dr. Hibbert is aware of what he's seeing and has made a calculation, similar to the one Burns makes, that the economic and professional consequences of raising these concerns outweigh the professional obligation to do so. Any of these readings is plausible. All of them are consistent with the radiation theory's broader logic. Springfield's medical establishment either cannot see the pattern or will not name it. And in the absence of anyone naming it officially, the pattern remains invisible to the population it affects. Professor Frink is the show's mad scientist character, a man of extraordinary intelligence and limited social functioning who exists at the intersection of genius and dysfunction. Frink can build and invent and calculate at levels that far exceed Springfield's general population. He is also unable to function in basic social situations and is treated as eccentric and slightly disturbing by the community around him. Under the radiation theory, Frink represents a specific kind of mutation, one that amplified certain cognitive functions while disrupting others. His scientific capacity is extraordinary. His social and emotional functioning is severely impaired. He is, in this reading, a more pronounced version of what the contamination does to Springfield's residents in general. It disrupts normal human functioning while sometimes producing unusual capabilities as a side effect. The fact that Frink can build things that no normal person could build, while being unable to sustain a normal conversation or a normal relationship, is not just a character type. It's a specific pattern of neurological effect that the radiation theory accounts for. Certain neural pathways enhanced to an unusual degree, other pathways disrupted or suppressed. The overall result is a person who is extraordinary in specific ways and incapacitated in others, which is a description that applies in various proportions to virtually every significant character in Springfield. Even Principal Skinner, or rather Armin Tamzarian, participates in this pattern. The man who built a completely convincing false identity and maintained it for 20 years demonstrates a specific kind of adaptive social intelligence that contrasts sharply with his apparent inability to navigate the relatively simple interpersonal dynamics of running a school or managing a relationship with his mother. His capacity for sustained deception is remarkable. His capacity for ordinary adult functioning is, by the show's consistent characterization, significantly limited. The contamination doesn't produce uniform effects. It interacts with individual biology in ways that produce different expressions in different people. But the pattern holds. Springfield residents function unusually. Their capabilities are distributed in ways that don't match what you'd expect from an unaffected population. Some things are enhanced, other things are impaired. And the overall picture, when you look at it across the full cast of characters, is a population that has been biologically altered by something in their environment in ways that are widespread, consistent, and never publicly acknowledged. Number, Section 17. The philosophical question Springfield keeps asking. There is a philosophical question that runs underneath every single one of the theories we've discussed, connecting them at a level deeper than the surface evidence of any individual mystery. It is not a question about radiation or comas or who shot Mr. Burns. It is a question about the nature of reality and the relationship between what is true and what a community is willing to acknowledge as true. Springfield asks this question every episode, in every reset, in every moment where something that should be a permanent change becomes a temporary one, in every collective forgetting of a catastrophe that should have consequences. The question is, when enough people agree that something is real, does it become real? And when enough people agree that something is not real, does it stop being real? The principal and the pauper answered this question directly, and the fans hated the answer. The town voted. The vote made the lie legally real. The truth was expelled. If that's how Springfield works, and the evidence suggests it is, then reality in Springfield is not a fixed thing. It's a negotiated one, a consensus product. What is real in Springfield is what the people of Springfield are willing to say is real, and what is not real is what they've agreed to stop acknowledging. This makes Springfield, in a certain light, a deeply American setting for a deeply American show. Because the relationship between consensus reality and factual reality has always been complicated in American public life. There have always been things that were demonstrably true but that large portions of the population were unwilling to acknowledge, because acknowledging them would require responses that the people with power over those responses preferred not to make. The history of environmental contamination in real American communities is full of versions of Springfield, places where the evidence of harm was present and documented and visible, and the communities continued to function as if the evidence didn't exist because the economic cost of acknowledging it was too high. Springfield is a satire of this, but it's also a straightforward depiction of it. The show isn't exaggerating for comic effect when it shows the town choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. It's drawing with slightly more heightened lines, a picture that matches the contours of real American communities and real American decisions about what is and isn't worth seeing. The coma theory adds a layer to this that moves from the political to the personal. If Homer is dreaming, if Springfield is the product of an unconscious mind generating a simulation of a desired reality rather than reporting on an actual one, then the question of what's real in Springfield connects to a more intimate version of the same philosophical problem. The reality Homer creates in his coma is not factually true. The children haven't aged, the wife hasn't moved on, the house hasn't changed, the job hasn't ended, but it's emotionally real. It's the reality that Homer needs. And in the absence of his ability to access any other reality, it's the reality he inhabits. Is that reality less valid than the one being lived outside the hospital? The show doesn't answer this. It never quite asks it directly. But it builds the architecture around the question and leaves the question sitting there, in the space between every reset and every collective forgetting and every episode that ends with everything back to normal. What is Springfield? It's whatever enough people agree Springfield is. What is Homer's life? It's whatever his dreaming mind can sustain. What is real in a town that votes to expel truth? Whatever the vote says. And what are we, the audience, doing when we watch Springfield and accept the yellow skin and the impossible geography and the floating timeline and the man who never dies? We're voting too. Every time we tune in, every time we find the show funny and endearing and worth returning to, we're casting a vote for Springfield's consensus reality. We're participating in the collective agreement that this is how things are, that these are the terms on which Springfield exists, and that the truths we've identified across 36 years of close watching are interesting but not disqualifying. We love Springfield the way Springfield loves its lies, with full knowledge of what they are, because the alternative is harder. Number, Section 18. Why the Simpsons will never end. There is a question that has circulated in pop culture conversations about The Simpsons for at least 15 years. When will it end? When will the show stop? At what point does a cultural institution of this scale and duration make the decision to conclude? The answer, which the show itself has been quietly articulating for a long time, is that it won't. Not because Fox won't allow it to end or because the creative team doesn't know how to end it. Because the show has become something that isn't quite a television program anymore. It is a piece of cultural infrastructure. It is something that exists in a different category from other television shows. The category of things that continue because their continuation serves a purpose beyond the delivery of new entertainment. The Simpsons has been on the air for longer than many of its current viewers have been alive. For those viewers, it has always been there. It was there before they arrived, and it will presumably be there after they leave. It is part of the permanent furniture of American cultural life, the same way certain monuments and institutions and geographic features are permanent furniture. You don't ask when the Grand Canyon is going to stop being the Grand Canyon. You don't ask when the Library of Congress is going to stop housing books. You don't ask when The Simpsons is going to end, because The Simpsons is part of the permanent landscape. The floating timeline serves this function. By keeping the characters frozen, by ensuring that each new season presents the same family in the same configuration they've always been in, the show eliminates the accumulation of change that leads stories toward conclusions. Stories end when things change irreversibly. Stories end when people age past the point where the story they're in can continue to hold them. Stories end when the world they inhabit has changed so much from its beginning that the connection to that beginning can no longer be maintained. Springfield doesn't change. The characters don't age, the house doesn't change. The fundamental dynamics of the family don't shift, and because none of these things change, the story has no internal mechanism driving it toward a conclusion. It can continue indefinitely because there is no destination it is moving toward. It has always already arrived. This is, depending on how you look at it, either the show's greatest limitation or its greatest achievement. The inability to end is also the ability to be permanent. The refusal to change is also the capacity to be always recognizable. The floating timeline that prevents any individual season from being definitively better than any other also prevents any season from being definitively the last. The coma theory frames this most movingly. If Homer is dreaming, the dream doesn't have a natural conclusion. Dreams don't move toward destinations the way waking life does. They loop, they recombine, they run variations. And as long as the unconscious mind generating the dream has the energy to continue generating it, the dream continues. Homer's dream of his family doesn't have an ending built into its structure. It has a sustaining principle, the love that generates it. And love doesn't have a natural expiration date. So the show continues, season after season, episode after episode. The same couch gag in endless variation, the same theme music, the same establishing shot of the power plant and the town and the house, the same family sitting down together at the end of every opening credits sequence, at the moment before the story of the week begins. The Simpsons will end someday. Everything ends, but it will end from outside, not from inside. The story doesn't want to end. The dream doesn't want to stop. The loop doesn't want to be broken. Springfield will resist its own conclusion the same way it resists every other truth that would require it to change. It will vote against it. It will tie the ending to a train and expel it from the community. It will continue, as long as enough people keep watching, as long as enough of us keep participating in the agreement that Springfield is real, and the family is fine, and the beer is cold, and the children are young, and the credits will roll, and next week everything will be exactly the same. That's the final theory, the one that explains everything. Not the radiation and not the coma, though both of those are real within the show's logic. The final theory is this: The Simpsons exists because we need it to exist. Because the version of America it represents, the messy, chaotic, dysfunctional, loving, infuriating, indestructible middle-class American family, is something that American culture cannot afford to watch disappear. And so it doesn't disappear. And so the show continues. And so the timeline floats. And so the characters stay young. And so we keep watching. Because as long as Homer is stumbling home from the plant, and Marge is managing everything with her particular combination of patience and steel, and Bart is on his skateboard somewhere causing trouble, and Lisa is in her room playing her saxophone and asking questions nobody wants to answer, and Maggie is watching everything with those enormous knowing eyes behind the pacifier, some version of something essential about the American family is still intact. And we need it to be intact. All evidence to the contrary, all the cracked towers and poisoned water, and votes against truth and impossible timelines, we need the family on Evergreen Terrace to be okay. So they are. So they stay. So the loop keeps running. And every Sunday night for 36 years and counting, we press play. Number. Section 918. The Children of Springfield. What the Next Generation Reveals. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old for 36 years. This is the foundational fact around which every other temporal impossibility in Springfield is organized. But Bart is not just a fixed point in the show's timeline. He is the show's most articulate statement about what happens when a child exists in an environment that fundamentally does not work properly. Bart's defining characteristic is his resistance to authority. He is, from the very first episode to the most recent season, a kid who will not comply. He pranks, he subverts, he refuses, he redirects institutional expectations toward outcomes nobody authorized. He is the child who writes on the blackboard every episode as punishment and who treats the punishment as material for the next prank. He is the child who exists in permanent productive tension with every structure that tries to contain him. Under the radiation theory, Bart's resistance takes on a different dimension. Bart has grown up inside a contamination zone, drinking the water, breathing the air, being shaped by an environment that the show's own logic suggests has effects on cognitive development. And yet Bart's specific form of cognitive expression is not the diminished capacity that affects Homer or the accelerated capacity that seems to characterize Maggie. Bart is smart in specific ways. He is a gifted social engineer. He understands people and their patterns and their vulnerabilities with an intuitive precision that no one around him gives him credit for. He uses this intelligence in service of chaos rather than in service of conventionally valued outcomes, and this is why the adults in his life consistently misread him as simply troubled rather than as specifically and unusually talented. What the radiation has done to Bart, if the theory holds, is root his intelligence away from the channels that conventional assessment would recognize and toward channels that conventional assessment would label as behavioral problems. He can't sit still in school, not because he lacks intelligence, but because the school, with its curriculum and its structure and its implicit promise that compliance leads to reward, represents exactly the kind of institutional logic that Bart's particular wiring finds intolerable. He knows, at a gut level that he cannot articulate but that his behavior expresses continuously, that the system doesn't deliver on its promises. That compliance in Springfield doesn't lead to the outcomes compliance is supposed to lead to. That the deal the school is offering is not a good deal. He is, in this reading, the most realistic member of the family. The one whose response to Springfield's actual conditions most closely matches what those conditions rationally call for. Bart's chaos is a correct assessment of the situation, expressed through the only tools available to a 10-year-old who can see the problem but cannot name it. Lisa's situation is different. Lisa's intelligence is recognized and labeled by the show as genius. She is articulate and academically exceptional, and aware of her own capacity in ways that Bart is not. And this recognition, this awareness that she is smart, has been the source of Lisa's most persistent suffering, because being visibly and articulately smart in Springfield is a specific kind of vulnerability. Springfield is organized around a set of values in which intelligence is tolerated when it is productive for the people in power and penalized when it threatens them. Lisa's intelligence threatens. Her questions lead to places the community doesn't want to go. Her observations identify things the collective agreement prefers to leave unidentified. And so she is isolated, not through any overt act of exclusion, but through the accumulating weight of a community that consistently signals that her kind of seeing is unwelcome. Under the coma theory, Lisa's position in the dream is heartbreaking in a specific way. If Homer is dreaming, if Springfield is the product of an unconscious mind generating its most desired version of reality, then Lisa's loneliness is something that Homer's dreaming mind includes despite everything. He could, in the logic of a dream, make Lisa happy. He could give her the community she deserves, the peers who would value her, the adults who would listen. He doesn't. She remains isolated, brilliant, and alone in a town that doesn't know what to do with her. Which means Homer's dream is honest about this. His unconscious mind knows that Lisa has always been somewhat alone. It knows that this is part of who she is and part of what Springfield is, and it doesn't sanitize it. Even in the dream, even in the version of reality that Homer's mind generates out of love, Lisa is still the kid in her room with her saxophone, asking questions nobody answers. That is either a failure of the dream's generosity, or it is the dream's deepest act of honesty, loving someone enough to know them truly, rather than constructing a more comfortable version of them. Homer's dream doesn't give Lisa a community because Homer knows, at some level that even unconsciousness can access, that Lisa doesn't quite fit. And knowing that about her, holding that truth alongside the love, is perhaps the most genuinely parental thing the dream does. Bart and Lisa's relationship with each other is the most complicated emotional dynamic in the show. They are, by most social expectations, not compatible. Bart is everything that conventionally gets labeled as problematic. Lisa is everything that conventionally gets labeled as commendable. In most narratives, they would be in opposition, representatives of two incompatible approaches to existence that can only relate to each other as foils. But the show consistently shows them gravitating toward each other in moments of genuine crisis. When something is actually wrong, when the stakes are real, and the situation requires something more than the performance of their usual roles, Bart and Lisa find each other. They trust each other in the specific and calibrated way of siblings who have figured out exactly how much they can rely on the other and in what situations. Bart doesn't respect Lisa's academic work. Lisa doesn't respect Bart's chaos. But they respect each other, quietly, consistently, in the places where the performances fall away. This is the show's most honest family relationship, not the love between Homer and Marge, which is genuine but also subject to idealization by the coma dream logic. The relationship between Bart and Lisa is too specific and too ambivalent to be idealization. It's what actual sibling love looks like, complicated by personality difference and social role and the specific irritations of proximity, but sustaining nonetheless, built on a recognition that goes beyond approval. Under the radiation theory, the relationship between them makes sense as the relationship between two people whose mutations have produced complementary rather than identical results. Bart's intelligence was routed in one direction. Lisa's was routed in another. They are not the same kind of smart, and they don't want the same things, and they couldn't be more different in the modes of expression available to them. But they came from the same water and the same air and the same house, and at the level where those origins register, they recognize each other. They always will. That's Springfield. That's what family means in a contamination zone. Number Section 20, the show about what we keep. Here's the question the show has been asking for 36 years without ever quite articulating it directly. What do you keep? When the world is what Springfield is, when the environment is contaminated, and the institutions are corrupted, and the billionaire has been lying to you for a century, and your memory keeps getting reset, and the truth keeps getting voted out of the community, what do you keep? What do you hold on to? What is worth the effort of preservation when everything around you is designed to make preservation difficult? The Simpsons answers this question the same way every episode, without stating it, without pointing at the answer and labeling it, just by showing you, week after week, what the family keeps. They keep each other. Homer, for all his damage, for all the cognitive impairment and the environmental poisoning and the crayon and the strategic incompetence and the decades of being broken by a system designed to break him, keeps coming home. He always comes home. Regardless of what happened during the episode, regardless of what chaos he caused or what disaster he was part of, or what lesson he was supposed to have learned and demonstrably didn't, Homer comes home. To the house on Evergreen Terrace, to Marge, to the kids. He comes home because they are the only thing he has that was not manufactured by the system that damaged him. The family is his, not Burns's, not Springfield's, not the floating timelines. His. Marge keeps going. This is her most defining and most under-examined quality. The patience the show assigns to her is not passive. It is active, deliberate, chosen. Every day, Marge Simpson gets up and continues. She manages the household and the finances and the children's crises and her husband's disasters and the town's various emergencies, and she does it not because she has no other option, though her options have sometimes been constrained. But because she has decided that this is what she is doing, she keeps going. She keeps the family going. In a world where everything keeps resetting, Marge is the mechanism of continuity. She is the thing that doesn't reset. Bart keeps his mischief. This sounds trivial, but it isn't. Bart's chaos is his integrity. In a town that has been organized to suppress resistance and reward compliance, in a community that voted to expel truth from its borders, Bart's refusal to comply is his most important quality. He doesn't comply with Springfield's social contract. He doesn't agree to forget what he saw or pretend the things that happened didn't happen. He keeps his irreverence because it is the only thing that still belongs entirely to him in a system that has been designed to take everything else. The pranks are not juvenile misbehavior. They are Bart's ongoing, articulate argument that the authority structures around him do not deserve his cooperation. Lisa keeps asking. That's all she does. She asks, and nobody answers satisfactorily, and she asks again. She doesn't stop. The isolation doesn't stop her. The dismissal doesn't stop her. The accumulating evidence that Springfield is not going to reward her questions, that the community is organized specifically to redirect her kind of attention away from the things it doesn't want examined, doesn't stop her. Lisa keeps asking because she cannot do otherwise. Because intelligence of her kind, whatever the radiation has amplified it into, does not permit the comfortable silence that gets rewarded in Springfield. She asks because the questions are real and because she is the only person in the family who cannot not ask them. And Maggie keeps watching. She has been watching for 36 years. She has been the family's silent witness, taking everything in, processing everything, filing everything away behind the pacifier and the enormous quiet eyes. She knows what she knows. She waits for what she's waiting for. And in the meantime, she is present. Completely, attentively, unwaveringly present. In a family where everyone else is sometimes elsewhere, sometimes lost in their own disaster or their own grief or their own impossibility, Maggie is always there, watching, present. What the family keeps collectively is each other. And what the show keeps, across 36 years of floating timelines and radiation theories and coma dreams and collective denials, is this family. This specific, impossible, yellow-skinned, four-fingered family in their house on Evergreen Terrace in their town that doesn't appear on any map. The show keeps them because we keep watching. And we keep watching because they keep each other. And something about that particular arrangement, that particular loop of love and continuity and stubborn presence in the face of everything that tries to disrupt it, resonates with something in us that we cannot quite put into words. Maybe because the love in Springfield, the love that persists through the coma and the radiation and the collective amnesia and the cracked cooling towers and all the rest of it, is the most honest thing in the show. More honest than any of the theories. More honest than any of the mysteries. The love is what's real. The love is what doesn't reset. The love is the thing that even an unconscious mind, dreaming in a hospital bed, keeps coming back to because it is the only thing that was ever truly his. Homer comes home. Every episode, every Sunday night, through everything, he comes home. And that's the show. That's always been the show. Underneath the theories, underneath the mysteries, underneath 36 years of questions nobody in Springfield is allowed to answer. A man who loves his family, a dream that doesn't want to end, a family that keeps each other in a town that keeps forgetting everything else. The loop runs, the towers crack, the water flows. And on Evergreen Terrace, the lights are on. They're always on. Number. Expansion. The night the lights stayed on deepening. The radiation theory. There is a moment in the very first season of The Simpsons that most people have seen and virtually nobody has stopped to examine. Homer is at his workstation in Sector 7G. He is not doing his job. He is never doing his job. He is asleep or eating or staring at something on his desk with the particular blank expression that the show has made his signature. The expression of a man whose mind is not entirely present for the experience of being inside his own body. Behind him, through the round porthole window of the control room, the reactor glows. It glows the specific yellowish green that the show uses to signal nuclear material, the same color the show uses for the radioactive waste that gets dumped into rivers and piled onto playgrounds and left on desks as paperweights. The glow is constant. It is the backdrop of Homer's entire working life. He has spent more hours in that room, in that chair, in front of those controls, than he has spent doing anything else in his adult life. The reactor is more familiar to him than his own living room. He has been marinating in its proximity for decades. The show treats this as set dressing. The reactor glows because reactors glow, and the glow is the visual shorthand the animators use to remind you where Homer works. But within the logic of the radiation theory, that glow is not set dressing. That glow is the mechanism. Every hour Homer has spent in that room, every shift he has slept through, every donut he has eaten while warning alarms sounded and he did not respond, has been another increment of exposure adding to a total that has been accumulating since before Bart was born. And it's not just Homer. The power plant employs a significant portion of Springfield's working population. The show has depicted this across dozens of episodes. When the plant is threatened with closure, the town reacts with terror not merely because Burns controls the power supply, but because so many Springfield residents depend on the plant for their income. These people go to work every day inside a facility with 342 documented safety violations, and they go home to the same town where the plant's waste enters the water supply and the air and the soil. There's a scene in an early season where a worker at the plant is shown using a piece of radioactive material as a phone receiver, holding the glowing rod to his ear while taking a call, apparently because it was the most convenient object within reach. The show plays this for the absurdist horror of the visual, and it is horrifying, but then it moves on, and the worker is never seen suffering any consequence, and Springfield continues as if phone receivers made of radioactive material are simply part of the local workplace culture. Which, under the radiation theory, they are. The theory's most uncomfortable implication is not that the radiation has mutated Springfield's residents. It's that the mutation has progressed to the point where the residents have lost the capacity to recognize the mutation as mutation. Their baseline for normal human functioning is a Springfield baseline, calibrated to a population that has been altered so comprehensively and for so long that the alterations have become definitional. This isn't what sick looks like. This is just what Springfield looks like. This is just what people look like, here, in this town, under these conditions. You would need to bring someone from outside in order to see it. And the show does this quietly across hundreds of episodes. When outsiders visit Springfield, the real outsiders, the guest characters drawn with more naturalistic proportions, the people whose anatomy doesn't match the town's residents, they frequently react with a low-level unease that the show plays as comedy, but that reads, under this lens, as something more accurate. Springfield feels wrong to people from outside it. They can't always say why, but something registers. The FBI agents in various episodes who arrive to investigate something and end up baffled by the town's behavior. The regulatory inspectors who come to assess the power plant and who seem not to know where to start because the violations are so numerous and so severe that normal investigative frameworks break down. The various federal officials who pass through Springfield in the course of the show's run, and who always, eventually, leave. They don't stay. Nobody from outside stays. And maybe that's not coincidence. Maybe the body, exposed long enough to Springfield's ambient environment, starts to tell the person housing it that leaving would be the correct decision. The people who came from outside have a reference point the residents don't have. They know what it's supposed to feel like. And Springfield doesn't feel like that, so they go. The residents stay because they have no reference point. They don't know it's supposed to feel different. They just know this is home. Number, expansion. The beer consumer deepening. The coma theory. The episode where Homer enters his coma is set in spring. April 1st, specifically, April Fool's Day. The show flags this in the episode's title, So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show in a way that positions the whole event as a kind of cosmic joke, the universe pulling the longest prank in television history. The date matters because it gives the coma theory a specific ironic texture. The beginning of Homer's unconscious life, if the theory holds, is the most famous prank day on the calendar. The beer can that Bart shakes in the industrial paint shaker is a Duff can, which is the show's fictional beer brand and one of its most constant visual shorthand elements. Homer loves Duff. His relationship with Duff beer is one of the show's foundational characterizations. He drinks it at Moe's, he drinks it on the couch, he takes it to events where beer is inappropriate. He has expressed emotions about Duff's availability, with a depth of feeling that he has not always been able to locate for other subjects. The fact that the object that initiates his coma is a Duff can is not incidental. It's the show telling you something about the logic of dreams. The thing that sends you under is the thing you love. But it's the vending machine that's more interesting. Homer was hit by an exploding beer can and survived with minimal injury. He went to the hospital and was recovering. He saw a vending machine across the room. He tried to get candy from it. The machine fell on him and put him in a coma. A hospital vending machine. The absurdity of this is intentional. The show is making a joke about Homer's relationship with food, but in the context of the coma theory, the vending machine carries a different significance. Homer was not struck down by something dramatic or meaningful. He was struck down by the most mundane possible object in the most mundane possible way, while attempting to do the most Homer Simpson thing it is possible to do. He was trying to get a snack. That is the last conscious act of his waking life, if the theory is true. Reaching for a candy bar. And in the dream that follows, in the 32 years of episodes that the theory positions as products of his unconscious mind, Homer is reaching for things constantly. Reaching for donuts and beer, and love and recognition, and adventure, and the approval of a father figure who never gives it, and the respect of an employer who never learns his name. He is always reaching. The candy bar was the last reach of his waking life, and every subsequent reach, every desire and appetite and yearning that the post-coma episodes document, is the continuation of that gesture in the only space where it can now occur. The coma theory says the dream got more elaborate and more surreal as the seasons progressed because Homer's brain was deteriorating over time. Each season, the simulation requires a little more cognitive resource to maintain and has a little less of that resource available. The gaps in logic get larger. The plot resolutions get less grounded. The departures from realism become more frequent and more extreme. This isn't the writers losing interest in continuity. It's the dreaming brain losing the ability to sustain a consistent simulation. Early seasons, the dream is relatively coherent. The Simpsons pre-coma dealt with recognizable family problems. Post-coma, the early seasons still have significant coherence. The emotional content is real. The relationships feel grounded. The situations, while fantastical, are still tethered to something recognizable. By the middle seasons, the tether is longer. By the later seasons, the simulation is running on reduced power, and the seams show. But even in the most surreal and internally inconsistent of the later episodes, one thing doesn't change. Homer comes home. The resolution of almost every episode returns him to his family. Whatever adventure or disaster the episode has contained, whatever absurdity the plot required, the endpoint is Homer on the couch with Marge, or Homer at the dinner table with the kids, or Homer in his yard watching his neighbors live their impossible lives in his dreamed version of Springfield. The dream always comes home, because the home is why the dream exists. Number expansion. The gun that wasn't his deepening. The Burns shooting mystery. The detail about the gun deserves more attention than it usually gets. When Burns was shot, the weapon used was his own. This is established in the episode. Burns carried a firearm in a holster, and at some point before the shooting, the holster was emptied. The gun was gone from his person before the attack. Whoever shot Burns did not bring their own weapon. They found his. This constrains the shooter's profile in specific ways that the episode's official resolution somewhat skates past. The shooting was not planned by someone who arrived at the town meeting intending to shoot Burns. Or if it was planned, the plan involved knowing that Burns carried a firearm and intending to use that firearm rather than a personal weapon. Either way, the shooter had knowledge of or access to Burns's person in a way that required proximity before the shot was fired. A stranger couldn't have taken Burns's gun without getting close enough to notice and remove the weapon from the holster. Someone who was near Burns in the chaos of the town meeting's aftermath. Someone who had reason to be close to Burns without alarming him. Someone he might, in the confusion and anger of that evening, not have registered as a threat. Burns said when he named his attacker, "Oh, it's you." Not "who are you?" Not "what are you doing?" Not "stay away." "Oh, it's you." The phrasing is recognition and familiarity. It is the language of encountering someone expected, not the language of encountering a threat. Burns saw whoever was holding his gun and responded not with alarm, but with a kind of tired recognition, as if the encounter was something he had been anticipating at some level. If the shooter was Maggie, would Burns have this response to an infant? He barely acknowledges Homer's existence, despite Homer working for him for decades. The idea that he would recognize Maggie Simpson, specifically, as a known and identifiable figure worth greeting with quiet familiarity is difficult to square with what we know about how Burns relates to the people around him. Burns recognizes people who matter to his interests. Maggie has never mattered to his interests in any documented way prior to the shooting. But there are several people at that town meeting to whom Burns would say, "Oh, it's you," with exactly that combination of recognition and lack of surprise. Smithers. Burns would absolutely greet Smithers that way. Smithers, who was fired that day. Smithers, who was in a blackout from drinking, but whose blackout may not have been as complete as the investigation assumed. Smithers, who knew every detail of Burns's schedule and every characteristic of his personal habits, including the fact that he carried a firearm in a holster. Smithers, who loved Burns in the specific and consuming way the show has consistently documented, and who had just been fired by the person he loved more than he had ever loved anything else. Smithers' alibi involved shooting old Jasper in the wooden leg, which he did while blackout drunk, which raises the question of how precisely we should trust any account of what Smithers was doing during the period in question. Homer. Burns would greet Homer that way too, though with a different kind of familiarity. Homer worked for Burns. Burns never remembers his name, but he recognizes Homer's face. Homer in the parking lot after the meeting, holding Burns's gun. Having reached some limit inside himself that had been accumulating for years, Burns might look at him and say, "Oh, it's you," in the voice of a man who has been waiting for this particular employee to finally break. And Marge. This is the reading that has the most emotional coherence. Burns was infatuated with Marge. He pursued her during the period when she worked at the plant. He knows her face and her presence in the way people know the faces and presences of those they have been captivated by. If Marge were standing in front of him, holding his gun, he would say, "Oh, it's you," in a voice that contained everything the show established about his feelings for her: recognition, resignation, something that might, in Burns's specific and attenuated emotional register, resemble tenderness. And then he would let her shoot him. And when he woke up, he would protect her. Because that is what the episode shows Burns doing. He identifies Maggie, a baby who cannot be prosecuted. A target so perfect for misdirection that it could only have been chosen by someone who thought about it carefully, or by a man with resources and intelligence and a specific motivation to protect the person who actually pulled the trigger. Burns has survived a century by being strategically intelligent about what he acknowledges and what he doesn't. Taking a bullet and deciding who gets blamed for it is entirely within his documented operational range. Number. Expansion. The deals that built Springfield. Deepening the Burns economy theory. There is a version of Springfield's history that the show never tells in sequence, but that emerges when you arrange the individual pieces the show has disclosed across 36 seasons into a coherent picture. That picture is the story of how one man came to own a town. Burns did not arrive in Springfield as the richest man in town. He arrived as a member of an already wealthy family with a specific talent for recognizing which investments would translate wealth into control. The power plant was not his first venture. The show has established that Burns has interests across multiple sectors: real estate, media, manufacturing, government contracts. The nuclear power plant is his most visible holding and the one most central to Springfield's daily life, but it is one instrument in a larger arrangement. The instrument works because power, literal electrical power, is a dependency that cannot be easily replaced or circumvented. Every home, every business, every institution in Springfield runs on electricity that Burns's plant provides. This gives him a leverage that is not negotiable in the way that prices or contracts are negotiable. You can negotiate about costs and terms and timing. You cannot negotiate about whether you need electricity. You need it. Burns provides it. The negotiation starts from there and never quite escapes it. The safety violations are part of the leverage, not a failure of it. A power plant that was brought up to code, that was run according to proper safety procedures, that had its radioactive waste properly contained and its cooling towers properly maintained, would be a power plant that an outside regulatory body could assess and approve, and thereby license to continue operating independently of Burns's personal will. The violations create a facility that cannot survive regulatory scrutiny, which means the facility's continued operation depends entirely on regulatory scrutiny not being applied, which means Burns needs to control the conditions under which scrutiny is and isn't applied, which means Burns needs to control the political and governmental infrastructure of the town, which he does. The show has depicted Burns's political influence across dozens of episodes. Mayors defer to him, police chiefs accept his direction. The town's regulatory apparatus operates within parameters that Burns's influence established and that Burns's money maintains. This is not presented as controversial within the show's universe. It's background. It's the way things are. Burns has money, and Springfield's institutions respond to money the way institutions generally do, which is by accommodating the people who have the most of it. The deal with Grandpa Simpson that guaranteed Homer's employment is one articulation of this system. Burns committed a crime. Grandpa found out. Burns could have threatened Grandpa, or paid Grandpa, or simply denied the crime and used his influence to make the denial stick. Instead, he made a deal. He traded Homer's job security for Grandpa's silence. This is more sophisticated than simple threat or simple payment because it creates an ongoing relationship of mutual interest rather than a one-time transaction. Grandpa's silence is maintained not by fear but by the fact that the deal is still active. Homer still has his job. As long as Homer has his job, the deal's terms are being honored. As long as the deal's terms are being honored, Grandpa's silence is rational. Burns does this throughout Springfield. He creates ongoing relationships of mutual interest with the people who could cause him problems. The relationships look like favors or employment or community investment, and in a limited sense, they are those things. But they are structured so that the reciprocal expectation is always the same: silence, compliance, the continued agreement not to look too closely at the cracked towers and the glowing water and the man who has been alive since the McKinley administration. The entire town is, in this reading, a network of these deals. Not all of them documented, not all of them involving Burns personally, but all of them tracing back, somewhere in their structure, to the same logic that Burns introduced and that has been running Springfield's political economy ever since. The tragedy is not that the deals are corrupting. The tragedy is that the deals work. The town functions. People have jobs. The lights stay on. The schools stay open. Imperfectly but open. The hospital operates. The basic infrastructure of municipal life continues because Burns's arrangement, corrupt as it is, provides the economic foundation that makes that life possible. This is why nobody challenges Burns. Not because they can't see what he is, but because seeing what he is doesn't provide a path to something better. The alternative to Burns's arrangement is an arrangement without Burns, and without Burns, the power plant closes or is sold, and without the power plant, the town's largest employer disappears, and without that employer, the economic foundation of Springfield collapses. The people who would be most harmed by Burns's removal are the same people most harmed by his presence. The contamination zone is also the employment zone. The poison is also the paycheck. That's not a cartoon problem. That's a real one. And the show has been drawing its version of it in yellow lines with 4 fingers for 36 years. Number expansion. Maggie's eyes what she has seen. If Maggie Simpson is as intelligent as the show's accumulated evidence suggests, if her silence is a strategic choice rather than a developmental limitation, then the question of what she knows becomes very interesting. She has been present for nearly every significant event in the family's history. She was in the room during conversations that the adults believed were private. She was present during crises that the family was too overwhelmed to manage calmly, watching the adults around her fragment and reassemble and try again. She has been at the center of the family's daily life, carried and fed and changed and put to bed, and in all of that proximity she has had access to a continuous documentary of what the Simpsons family actually is, beneath the surface that each member presents to the others. What does she know about Homer? She knows that he loves her. The show has established this across dozens of episodes in moments that bypass the comedy and reach something more direct. Homer holds Maggie. Homer talks to Maggie in the particular voice that people use when they don't think anyone is judging them. Homer, who cannot express his love for his other children without some combination of awkwardness and self-sabotage, has always been able to express it for Maggie cleanly, simply, without the interference of his other inadequacies. There is a famous scene where Homer's locket is opened to reveal a note that says, "Do it for her," beside a photo of Maggie. Homer had placed this at his workstation as a motivating reminder. He was trying to do better, not for abstract reasons, not because the job was intrinsically important to him, but because Maggie existed, and he wanted to be someone Maggie could have as a father. The locket is the most honest object in the entire show. It says exactly what Homer means, with no editing, no comedy cushion, no Homer filter distorting the sentiment into something safer. Maggie has seen that locket. Maggie knows what it means. What does she know about Marge? She knows that Marge is the architecture of the family, the person whose sustained effort makes everything else possible. She has watched Marge manage situations that should have been unmanageable, watched her absorb disasters that would have broken other people, watched her love Homer through versions of Homer that were difficult to love. Maggie has seen the moments when the effort shows, the moments late at night when Marge's composure slips slightly, when the patience costs something visible. And she has seen Marge reassemble herself and continue, because that is what Marge does. There is an intimacy between Maggie and Marge that the show depicts differently from the relationships Marge has with the other children. Marge carries Maggie constantly. The physical closeness is continuous in a way that it isn't with Bart or Lisa, who are old enough to be ambulatory and independent. Maggie has spent more time in direct physical contact with Marge than any other family member, which means she has had access to Marge's body language and breath and heartbeat and emotional state in a way that is more direct and less filtered than any other relationship in the family. Maggie knows Marge in the way infants know their mothers, which is the most complete and the most honest way that any person can be known by another. Before language, before social presentation, before the learned performance of self that all adults engage in constantly. Marge cannot perform for Maggie because Maggie's access predates the performance. And Maggie, processing all of this with a cognitive capacity that exceeds her apparent developmental stage, has assembled from these observations a model of the family that is probably more accurate than anything any of the other family members have access to. She knows what Homer actually is, underneath the chaos. She knows what Marge actually is, underneath the patience. She knows what Bart actually is, underneath the mischief. She knows what Lisa actually is, underneath the certainty. And she knows what Springfield actually is, because she has been carried through it, eyes open, since the day she arrived in it. She has seen the power plant from the car window. She has been pushed in her stroller past the signs and the institutions and the buildings of a town that has been hiding something for decades. She has been in the room when the adults discussed things they thought she couldn't understand. She understood. The pacifier is not a sign of helplessness. The pacifier is a boundary. It is the thing that keeps the words inside when the words would cost too much. Maggie has decided, with the precision of a strategist who has had 36 years to observe and assess, that speaking is not the right move yet. Yet, whatever Maggie is waiting for, whenever the moment arrives that makes speech worth the exposure it creates, Springfield is going to discover that the quietest person in the family was also the most prepared. She has been watching, she has been thinking, she has been patient in the way that Homer has never been and Marge has had to learn and Bart refuses to be and Lisa struggles to sustain. Naturally patient, strategically silent, ready, number. Expansion. The weight of laughter, what the comedy is hiding. There is something the show does so consistently and so skillfully that it has become invisible. It makes you laugh at things that, examined outside the frame of comedy, are genuinely devastating. Homer gets hurt. The show plays this for laughs. Homer falls down the Springfield Gorge and bounces off every surface on the way down and lands at the bottom in a broken heap, and then gets airlifted back to the top of the gorge for the ambulance to land at the hospital, and then immediately falls back down the same gorge again. It is one of the most purely comedic sequences in the show's history. The audience laughs because the repetition is absurd, and the escalation is absurd, and Homer's dazed survival of each impact is absurd. But Homer Simpson is a human being inside this story, or the closest thing the show has to a human being, and he just fell down a gorge twice and bounced off every rock and tree branch on the way down. Both times. If you removed the comedic timing from that sequence and replaced it with realistic sound design and realistic physical consequences, you would have one of the most disturbing things American television has ever shown. The comedy is the mechanism by which the show shows you terrible things and keeps you watching. The laughter is not a denial of the darkness. It is the container that makes the darkness bearable long enough to deliver it. The Simpsons has been doing this since the first season. It has been showing you a man who is cognitively impaired and physically abused and professionally humiliated and emotionally damaged by a childhood defined by loss, and it has made all of this funny enough that you can absorb it without the full weight landing at once. The weight is still there. It's just distributed across 36 years of laughter, delivered in increments small enough to metabolize. This is why the theories resonate so deeply with the people who find them. The theories are doing something the comedy makes it easy to avoid. They're looking at Springfield directly, without the comedic frame, and saying what they see. And what they see is not a quirky animated family living a chaotic but basically fine life. What they see is a town in crisis, a family built on damage, a system designed to exploit the people inside it, and a set of characters too compromised by their own circumstances to escape the structures that constrain them. The theories give Springfield's weight somewhere to land. They are, in a way, the audience's equivalent of what Homer does when he removes the crayon. They make the picture clearer. They allow Springfield to be seen as it actually is, rather than as the comedy framing allows you to process it. And, like Homer's experience with the crayon removed, seeing Springfield clearly is uncomfortable. It is genuinely, specifically uncomfortable in a way that the comedic presentation is designed to prevent. But unlike Homer, we don't have to put the crayon back. We can hold both versions simultaneously. The version that is funny and warm and endlessly quotable, and the version that is a portrait of a contaminated community and a damaged family and an economic system that has been exploiting the people inside it since before any of them were born. The show is big enough to hold both. That's why it has lasted. That's why it has generated more theories and more analysis and more sustained attention than any other animated series in history. Because it is not just a comedy, it never was just a comedy. It is a comedy that contains everything else, all the darkness and the love and the damage and the longing, compressed into 22 minutes and wrapped in yellow and broadcast into American living rooms every Sunday night for 36 years. You can watch it for the jokes, millions of people do, or you can watch it for what's underneath the jokes. What the theories are doing is watching it for both at once, holding the comedy and the darkness in the same frame, and finding that when you do that, Springfield becomes something more complex and more honest and more beautiful than either reading alone could produce. That is the final argument for every theory in this video. Not that any one of them is definitively true, but that all of them, taken together, constitute a reading of the show that honors the full range of what the show actually is. A comedy about a family, a tragedy about a town, a love story about a man dreaming of the people he can't reach, a political story about power and who holds it and what it costs everyone else, a science fiction story about what radiation does to living things, a philosophical story about the relationship between truth and what communities agree to call truth. All of it, simultaneously. All of it in Springfield. All of it in the same cracked, glowing, impossible town. Number, expansion. The long goodbye, a final theory about what the show is for. Here is the last thing. The Simpsons began in 1989. The people who were children when it premiered are now in their 40s. The people who were teenagers when Homer first fell down that gorge have children of their own, who have grown up with the show running in the background of their lives. 3 generations of American families have watched the same fictional family stay exactly the same age across their entire shared experience. The Simpsons is the only family that hasn't changed. The parents of those 1989 children are older now. Some of them are gone. The houses those children grew up in have been sold or renovated or torn down and replaced. The neighborhoods have changed. The schools have changed. The specific texture of the world that formed those people has been continuously replaced by a new texture, as it always is, as it always has been, as it will continue to be. And every Sunday night, the couch gag plays, and the family runs in from different directions and lands on the couch in a pile, and Homer gets squished by the garage door or whatever the variation is, and the theme plays, and Springfield is exactly as it was. The show is, at this level of analysis, a monument to a specific and universal kind of grief. The grief of time passing. The grief of the world your childhood occupied becoming inaccessible, not through dramatic loss, but through the slow replacement of everything that constituted it with things that don't quite match. The grief of growing up and finding that the world you grew up in is not the world you now inhabit, and that it cannot be recovered. Springfield can be recovered. That's what the floating timeline gives the audience that it cannot give itself. The characters don't age because we can't afford for them to age, because aging means that we have aged. Because Bart turning 11 means that the version of ourselves who first watched Bart be 10 is further away than it was. Because Homer getting older means getting older is what happens and there is no reset button, and the couch is gone and the house is gone, and the people who sat beside you on that couch the first time you watched the opening credits are scattered or changed or lost. The show holds that grief at bay. As long as the loop runs, As long as Springfield persists, as long as the family is on Evergreen Terrace, the world where you first found them still exists somewhere. It exists in the show. It is preserved there. Not your specific world, your specific couch, your specific version of being 10 or 16 or 23 the first time a particular episode aired, but the feeling of that world, the texture of that time, the sense that the family was there and everything was complicated but okay and the credits would roll, and next week there would be another episode and the world, for 22 minutes, would be completely familiar. That is what Springfield is. That is what it has always been. Not a prediction engine, not a contamination zone, not a coma dream, though it contains the logic of all of these things. Springfield is a container for the feeling of a world that used to exist and that the people who loved the show when they were young can return to whenever they need to. The theories are how those people think about Springfield when they're being intellectually serious about it. But the reason they keep coming back, the reason the theories generate such passionate engagement and such sustained attention, is not the intellectual puzzle of it, it is the love of it. The specific and inarticulate love of a place and a family and a set of characters who have been present through so much of a life that they have become part of the furniture of that life. We built the theories because we needed a serious reason to keep taking Springfield seriously. But the real reason has always been simpler and less articulable and more important. We love them, the yellow family and the yellow town and the impossible geography that doesn't appear on any map. We love Homer, who is damaged and funny and sometimes terrible and who always, without exception, comes home. We love Marge, who is patient in the way that only people with great reserves of internal strength can sustain patience without losing themselves inside it. We love Bart, who will not comply and whose refusal to comply is the most honest thing about him. We love Lisa, who keeps asking when everyone else has stopped because she cannot do otherwise, and whose inability to do otherwise is both her greatest suffering and the thing that makes her essential. And we love Maggie, the silent one, the one who watches everything and says nothing and knows more than anyone and waits. We love her because she is, of all of them, the one who most resembles how it feels to watch the show. Quiet, attentive, present, taking everything in, knowing more than you can say, waiting for the moment when whatever you've been carrying will finally make sense to say out loud. Maggie is the audience. She has always been the audience. And like the audience, she is patient enough to wait for the show to give her the moment she's looking for. It will. The show always gives you that moment. Eventually. In some episode, in some season, the thing you've been waiting for arrives. The feeling connects. The comedy opens up and the thing underneath it is briefly, completely visible. And then the credits roll. And next week, everything is back to normal. And that's fine. That's exactly right. Because next week, you'll be back too. We always come back to Springfield. It's the only hometown that never changes. Number coda. One last look before the lights go down. Before we leave Springfield entirely, there is one more thing worth sitting with. Every theory in this video, every piece of evidence we followed, every mystery we reopened, and every question we let hang in the air unanswered, all of it points at the show and says, look closer. There is more here than the surface presents. The comedy is a door, and behind the door is a room, and the room contains something the comedy is designed to make bearable. But there is something the theories cannot account for, something that exists outside the analytical framework that makes theories possible. And that is the fact that the show is, on its face and in its bones, about love. Not the complicated love that requires explanation, or the damaged love that requires analysis. The simple kind. The kind that shows up in the small moments the show has always been better at than the large ones. Homer and Maggie in the locket scene. Not a word of dialogue. Just a man at his workstation who has placed a reminder of his daughter where he can see it. Just love, expressed in the simplest possible way, by a man who is not eloquent and not particularly self-aware, and not by most measures particularly good at his life, but who loves his daughter. Simply, without complication. Marge at the kitchen window. Not a plot point, not a story beat. Just a woman looking at her family in the yard, in the particular way that people look at the things they have chosen and are choosing again, continuously, in the small daily decisions that constitute a life. Bart visiting Lisa when she's sad. Not announced, not made into a moment the episode asks you to notice. Just there, quietly, the brother who will not comply with anything except this. He shows up for his sister when she needs him to. Lisa playing her saxophone alone in her room. The music is always a little too big for the instrument and a little too big for the room and completely appropriate for the person playing it. She is always playing towards something outside the walls of the house and the town and the show, toward a version of the world that has more room in it for what she is. The saxophone is her argument that such a world exists. And Maggie, always Maggie, in the corner of the frame, watching everything with those enormous eyes, behind the pacifier, saying nothing, knowing everything, ready for the moment that hasn't come yet. These are the show, not the theories, though the theories are also the show. Not the mysteries, though the mysteries are also the show. These quiet, unremarkable, completely ordinary moments of a family being a family are what the show has been building toward across every single one of its 36 seasons and every single one of its 788 episodes. The radiation explains the yellow skin and the four fingers and the impossible survival rate and the collective forgetting. The coma explains the frozen time and the escalating surrealism and the celebrity appearances and the dream logic that increasingly governs the show's later seasons. The Springfield Files and the Sundial and Homer's Confession and the alternate endings explain why the Burns shooting was never really solved. The Burns immortality theory explains why the richest man in Springfield has been the richest man in Springfield for longer than the country itself has been keeping reliable records. The Principal and the Pauper explains why the town resets, why the truth keeps getting expelled, why the comfortable lie is always the one that stays. And Maggie's silence explains why the most capable person in the family is the one nobody talks about when they talk about the family. All of it is true. All of it is there in the show, waiting to be seen by whoever is paying close enough attention. But underneath all of it, simpler than any theory and more durable than any mystery, is the family. The yellow family in the yellow house in the impossible town. Damaged and funny and loving and loud and together, still together, after everything, together. That's what we came to Springfield for. That's what the theories were always in service of. That's what the loop is protecting. The family is okay. They are always okay. And we can come back next week and they will still be okay. In a world where most things change without permission and most goodbyes arrive before you're ready for them, that is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. Number a note on the town that remembers you. There is a strange thing that happens when you watch The Simpsons for long enough. You stop watching it and start remembering it. The episodes blur together, not because they're indistinct, but because they've been absorbed. The specific plots lose their edges and what remains is a feeling, a texture, the accumulated weight of having spent time in Springfield across years and decades of your own life. You remember the jokes without remembering the context. You remember the emotional beats without remembering the storylines. You remember Springfield the way you remember a place you grew up in, not as a sequence of events, but as a continuous atmosphere, a set of sensory impressions and emotional associations that don't resolve into narrative but into something more like experience. The show has been running long enough that it exists in this category for millions of people, not as a television program they watch, but as a place they've been, a place they can return to, a place that remains consistent across the years of their lives in a way that very few actual places manage to. This is the final and most under-examined dimension of the Springfield mystery, not what the radiation has done to the residents, or what the coma has done to Homer's perception of reality, or who really fired the gun at Burns, but what the show has done to us, what 36 years of consistent Springfield has done to the people who grew up with it. It has given us a place, a real one, in the only sense that ultimately matters, which is that it is real to us. It exists in our memory and in our conversation and in the specific vocabulary of reference and quotation that Simpsons fans share across generations and continents. The show is so thoroughly embedded in global popular culture that quoting it is a form of recognition, a way of saying, I grew up in Springfield too, I know that place, I remember those people. That is not what television usually does. Television usually entertains and moves on. The Simpsons did something different. It stayed. It kept accumulating, kept adding to the architecture of a place that people could return to, kept maintaining the consistency that makes a place rather than just a sequence of images. And the floating timeline is what made this possible. The characters didn't age, so the place didn't age. Springfield in 1989 is the same Springfield as Springfield in 2025. Not because nothing has changed in Springfield's content, but because the essential things, the people and the house and the relationships and the dynamics and the tone, are continuous. You can go back to a Springfield episode from 15 years ago and recognize everything. You are not visiting a historical artifact. You are visiting a place that is still inhabited. That is extraordinary. No other fictional world has maintained this kind of continuous present across this span of time for this many people. And the theories are, at their heart, an expression of how real that world has become. You don't build elaborate, evidence-based, internally consistent theories about places that don't matter to you. You build them about places you love, places you want to understand more completely, places whose mysteries feel important because the place itself feels important. The radiation theory and the coma theory, and all the others, are love letters to Springfield, written in the language of analysis, organized like arguments, presented as intellectual exercises. But underneath the structure, they are expressions of the same impulse that makes someone drive past their childhood home just to see it still standing. The impulse to confirm that the place is real, that it exists, that it can still be found. Springfield is still there. The theories confirm it. The mysteries confirm it. The questions that remain unanswered after 36 seasons confirm it, because you cannot have unanswered questions about a place that doesn't exist. The show is still running. The family is still on the couch gag still plays, and somewhere in a town without a fixed location, in a state that keeps changing, on a street that doesn't appear on any map, the lights are on in the house on Evergreen Terrace. They're always on. Come back whenever you need to. Springfield will be here. It always is. Good night.